Hey guys, imagine this. You're dropped smack in the middle of 19th century New York. No phone, no Uber, just you against a swarm of knife-wielding thugs in a slum where the average lifespan is shorter than a bad Tinder date. Think you'd last 24 hours? Ha! By sunrise, you'd be begging for a time machine. Welcome to the deadliest gang slums of old New York, where survival wasn't a skill, it was a miracle wrapped in absurdity and drenched in blood. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Picture it. The year is 1850, and you're stumbling off a creaky wooden ship onto the docks of Manhattan. Your lungs already choking on the foul stench of rotting fish, human waste, and unwashed dreams. New York City, the so-called gateway to opportunity, but for most immigrants pouring in from Ireland, Germany, and God knows where else, it's more like the mouth of hell. You've got nothing but the rags on your back and a pocket full of false hopes. Welcome to the 5 Points, the infamous slum where 5 streets converge into a vortex of vice, violence, and vermin. This isn't your trendy Brooklyn hipster haven. This is a labyrinth of crumbling tenements, where buildings lean on each other like drunks at last call, and the ground is a perpetual mud soup mixed with sewage and secrets. Oh, you'd think, I can handle a little grit, I've seen movies. But darling viewer, those Hollywood depictions, they're sanitized fairy tales. The real 5 Points was a petri dish of despair, home to over 20,000 souls crammed into a few square blocks, where privacy was a myth and death was your nosy neighbor. Gangs ruled here like deranged kings in a madhouse court. The Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, the Plug Uglies, names that sound absurdly cartoonish, right? Like rejects from a bad comic book. But these weren't quirky anti-heroes. They were feral packs of men, and women, don't forget the ferocious ladies, who turned survival into a blood sport. Let's start your doomed 24-hour clock at dawn, because why not begin with the illusion of a fresh start? The sun's barely peeking over the horizon, casting a sickly glow on the ramshackle hovels. You're waking up, if you can call it that, in a rookery, one of those overcrowded flop houses where a bed is a straw mat shared with a dozen strangers, their snores mingling with the scurrying of rats the size of small dogs. Fun fact, these rats weren't just pests, they were dinner for the desperate. Imagine rolling over and feeling whiskers tickle your face. Not cute, not Disney, just a prelude to rabies or worse. Your stomach growls, demanding breakfast. Ha! In the 5 Points, food is a gamble. The markets, piles of questionable produce rotting under the watchful eyes of vendors who'd sell you their grandmother's bones if it turned a profit. You might snag a loaf of bread laced with sawdust for bulk, or a hunk of meat that's been aged in ways that would make modern health inspectors faint. But watch out, those street urchins, the newsies, and pickpockets are eyeing you like a walking wallet. One wrong glance, and poof, your meager coins are gone. And if you chase them, you're diving into alleys where the gangs lurk, ready to initiate newcomers with a blackjack to the skull. Speaking of gangs, let's meet the stars of this nightmare circus. The Dead Rabbits, Irish immigrants with a flair for the dramatic. Their name? A Twisted Tale. Dead Rabbit was slang for a rowdy tough guy, but legend has it, it started when a gang member hurled a dead bunny into a rival meeting. Absurd? Absolutely. But these lads carried clubs wrapped in eel skins and wore red stripes on their pants like some demented uniform. Their rivals, the Bowery Boys, were nativists, native-born Americans who hated immigrants with a passion that fueled bar brawls into full-scale riots. Dressed in top hats and fireman coats, many were volunteer firefighters because nothing says hero like starting fires to loot during the chaos. They'd stomp through the streets looking for trouble. Your first hour, navigating to find work. Jobs in the slums were as scarce as honesty. Factories churned out textiles and tools, but wages were a pittance, maybe 50 cents a day for 14 hours of backbreaking labor. Women and kids fared worse, sewing piecework in dim cellars, fingers bleeding from needles or scavenging rags from dumps. But hey, if you're lucky, you could join a gang for protection. Protection from what? Everyone else, including the gang itself. Pay up or get plugged, as in beaten senseless by the Plug Uglies, Another crew named for their wool hats stuffed with rags to cushion blows. Ironic, isn't it? Fashion as armor in a world where style could kill you. As the morning wears on, the streets come alive with a cacophony of curses in a dozen languages. Vendors hawk hot corn from steaming carts. Sounds innocent, but those ears were often plucked from fields fertilized with, well, let's just say organic in the worst way. You're parched, so you eye a water pump. Big mistake. New York's water in the 1800s was a toxic brew from the collect pond, now buried under slums but leaking cholera vibes. One sip, and you're courting the bloody flux or worse. Cholera epidemics swept through like grim reapers on speed, killing thousands in weeks. Bodies piled in streets, undertakers overwhelmed, and the gangs? They profited, looting the dead or charging for safe burials. By mid-morning, you've attracted attention. A Bowery boy spots your foreign accent. Bam, you're a target. Nativism was the flavor of hate here. Know-nothings political gangs preached America for Americans, which meant bashing Irish skulls. Fights erupted over nothing. A wrong look, a spilled ale, or just existing. Weapons, improvised genius. Arkansas toothpicks, big knives, brass knuckles, and the infamous slungshot, a weight on a rope that could crack your head like an egg. Women weren't spared. The gahals, gang malls, wielded hatpins and claws with ferocious glee. Let's pause for a historical absurdity. The gangs had elections, not democratic ones. Voting in New York was a farce. Gangs stuffed ballots, intimidated voters, and turned polling places into battlegrounds. In 1857, the Dead Rabbits and Bowery Boys clashed in a riot that left dozens dead, buildings torched, and the city in chaos. Police? Corrupt as they come, often gang members themselves. The municipal police versus metropolitan police feud in 1857 saw cops fighting each other while criminals ran wild. You'd call 911? Good luck. Telegraphs were for the rich, and runners might just rob you instead. Noon hits and hunger gnaws deeper. You duck into a grog shop, one of the 1,000 plus saloons in the area, where rot-gut whiskey flows like regret. But alcohol was escape and poison. Adulterated with turpentine or worse, it blinded or killed. Bar fights were legendary. Imagine a dead rabbit pulling a live rabbit from his coat as a battle cry, then charging with a brick bat. Absurd? Yes, but deadly. Survival tip, don't stare. Eyes down, mouth shut, or you're danced upon, stomped by hobnailed boots. Afternoon brings the heat, literal and figurative. Summers in the slums were saunas of suffering, with no AC, just festering heat-breeding disease. Tuberculosis, the white plague, claimed lives daily, coughing blood in crowded rooms. Kids played in gutters flowing with offal, their games interrupted by horse carcasses bloating in the sun. You'd think, I'll just leave. But escaping the 5 points? Borders were gang turf lines, cross wrong and you're in a turf war. Enter the pain of survival. Families shattered. Irish famine refugees arrive skeletal, only to face more starvation. Tenements like the old brewery housed 1,000 in squalor, with murderers' row basements where killings were nightly. Women prostituted in panel houses where walls hid thieves. Children? Street Arabs, begging or thieving, often orphaned young. As evening creeps, danger amps up. Lanterns flicker, casting shadows where muggers wait. The YO's gang, named for their bird-like calls, specialized in inventive cruelty, eye gouging, ear biting. One leader, Dandy Johnny Dolan, had spring-loaded eye gougers in his shoes. Fashion fatality at its finest. You're 24 hours? Barely halfway, and you're exhausted, filthy, terrified. But wait, viewer, comment below. Would you join a gang or try to flee? What's your survival strategy in this madhouse? Dusk falls like a shroud over the 5 points, and the real horrors awaken. The streets, already a maze of mud and misery, transform into a nocturnal carnival of carnage. You've made it this far. Congrats, you're tougher than most time-traveling tourists. But the night is when the gangs truly shine. Or rather, slither out like vampires with a grudge against hygiene. Let's rewind a tick. You're holed up in a dingy cellar, nursing a bruise from an earlier scuffle. The air, thick with the aroma of unwashed bodies, tobacco spit, and despair. Above, The sounds of fiddles and fights bleed through the floorboards, dance halls where free and easies lure the unwary. These joints, like Almack's or the Dive, were dens of debauchery, waltzes interrupted by stabbings, ale spiked with knockout drops for easy robbing. Enter at your peril. Exit in a pine box if lucky. Hunger persists, so you venture out for supper. Options? Oyster cellars serving bivalves dredged from polluted harbors, tasty typhoid treats, or hash houses dishing mystery meat stews, where beef might be yesterday's stray dog. Pay with what? If your pockets are empty, barter your shoes or soul. But bargaining in the slums? It's negotiation via intimidation. Haggle wrong and the vendor signals his gang pals. Night deepens, and the gas lamps, if they're not smashed, cast flickering pools of light amid inky blackness. Shadows hide the lush workers, thieves preying on drunks. Roll a passed out sot, standard gig. But get caught, and it's the Tombs for you. New York's grim prison, built on the old pond site, sinking into muck like the city's morals. Cells flooded, inmates starved, justice a joke. Gangs prowl in packs now. The roach guards, named for a butcher, or cockroaches fittingly, clash with the shirt tails who tucked shirts out like flags of idiocy. Absurd uniforms, plug uglies with their stuffed hats looking like deranged mushrooms. Fights? Epic. The 1834 riots saw churches burned, homes looted, all over anti-Catholic hysteria. You'd hide, but where? Tenements were tinderboxes, fires raged weekly, volunteer fire gangs competing to save, read extort, buildings. Survival's pain hits hard at night. Loneliness in crowds, immigrants missing homelands, families torn by disease, widows begging, kids in ragged schools if lucky, or factories losing limbs to machines. Women birthing in filth, mortality rates sky high. 1 in 4 kids died before 5. Heartbreaking stats masked by sarcasm, but the agony was real. Midnight tolls, if you hear bells over screams. Opium dens beckon, promising escape in hazy dreams, but delivering addiction and robbery. Brothels like the house of all nations catered to every vice. Syphilis the unwelcome souvenir. A gang brawl erupts nearby. Dead rabbits versus Bowery boys again. Bricks fly, pistols crack, rare but deadly. Blood slicks the cobblestones. You duck into an alley, heart pounding. But alleys? Dead ends of doom, where garroters strangle victims with wires. Escape? Climb fences laced with broken glass. As hours tick, fatigue sets in. Sleep? Perilous. Flop houses charge pennies for a spot on a rope. Lean on it, doze till morning yank. Fall off? Floor fodder for thieves. Dawn nears, but your ordeal's just warming. Viewer, hit that comment. What's the craziest historical fact you've heard? Share to keep the conversation alive. The witching hours drag on, each minute a mockery of modern comforts. You're huddled in a doorway, eyes darting at every rustle. Rats nibble at your toes, literal toe biters in this era. Above, the stars are blotted by soot from factories belching smoke 24/7. New York was industrializing, but at what cost? Lungs blackened, lives shortened, all for the almighty dollar hoarded by uptown elites. Historical absurdity peaks in the gang's codes. The YOs had a price list for crimes: punch $2, ear chew $15, murder $100. Like a violent menu at a deranged diner. Leaders like Monk Eastman with his pigeon flock and brass knuckles, or One Lung Curran inventing the blackjack. Innovation in iniquity. Pain underscores it all. Famine echoes for Irish, pogroms for Germans, slavery's shadow for free blacks in nearby neighborhoods. Race riots in 1863, draft riots saw lynchings, buildings razed, gangs joining the mob frenzy. You're fading, but survival demands vigilance. A prostitute approaches, temptation or trap. Many were gang lures, leading suckers to beatings. As false dawn glows, reflect, 12 hours down, body aching, spirit cracked. But the slums grind on, relentless. Viewer engagement time. Comment your time zone and if you'd risk the 5 points for a day. Let's see who's brave. The sky lightens, but hope? Diamond soars. Your 24-hour nightmare continues. Stay tuned for part 2, where things get bloodier. Alright, you're back for round 2 of your doomed 24-hour stint in New York's deadliest 1800s gang slums. By now, you're probably regretting that time machine fantasy, aren't you? Dawn's breaking over the 5 points, and you're still alive. Barely. Your body's screaming from a night dodging rats, thieves, and the occasional flying brick. The air's thick with coal smoke and the stench of despair, and you've got another 12 hours to survive this cesspool of chaos. Spoiler alert, it's about to get uglier with more absurd gang antics, gut-wrenching survival struggles, and enough historical madness to make you question why anyone called this place civilized. Let's dive back into the muck, shall we? The pale light of morning doesn't bring relief, it just illuminates the nightmare. You're slumped against a splintered wall in an alley off Mulberry Street, your clothes now a patchwork of mud, sweat, and something you hope isn't blood. Your stomach's gnawing itself into knots. Hunger's a cruel companion here, and the 5 points isn't exactly serving avocado toast. You're thinking, I'll find food, maybe a job, something to keep me going. Oh, sweet summer child, optimism in this slum is like bringing a paper fan to a gunfight. First, let's talk breakfast, because you're starving. The streets are waking up and vendors are already yelling about their wares. Moldy apples, questionable sausages, and coffee that's mostly burnt grain and regret. You shuffle toward a cart, clutching your last few pennies if you haven't been pickpocketed yet. The vendor, a grizzled man with a face like a slapped ham, eyes you suspiciously. Haggle? Risky. These guys are often gang affiliated, and a wrong word could earn you a fist or worse. You hand over your coins for a potato, scorched on the outside, raw inside, a 5 points delicacy. Chew fast because those street kids, the Bahoys and Gauls, are circling like pint-sized piranhas. Blink and they'll snatch your spud and leave you with a black eye for dessert. Now, you're thinking survival means work. Good luck. The 5 points job market is a dystopian lottery where everyone loses. Factories loom nearby, belching smoke and exploiting desperation. You could try for a spot in a sweatshop, stitching shirts until your fingers bleed for $1 a week. Or maybe you're tempted by the docks, unloading cargo for 12 hours straight, dodging falling crates and surly foremen who'd sooner whip you than pay you. Kids as young as 6 work here, losing limbs to machinery or getting crushed under barrels. Women, often stuck in slop work, cleaning rich folks' laundry in vats of lye that burn skin raw. And the gangs? They're the real employment agency, offering jobs like lookout, thief, or muscle. Sign up and you're theirs. Refuse and you're a target. Let's check the time. It's barely 7 a.m., and the streets are a buzzing hive of chaos. Horse-drawn carts clatter through, splashing you with mud that's 50% sewage. Pedestrians shove past. Everyone's in a hurry to nowhere. You hear the dead rabbit's signature whoops in the distance, a chilling reminder they're never far. These Irish brawlers with their red-striped pants and eelskin clubs aren't just thugs, they're a lifestyle. They clash daily with the Bowery Boys, those nativist firemen who'd rather torch an Irish tenement than save it. The absurdity? Both sides claim to be protecting their people, but it's just an excuse for bloodlust. In 1849, a riot over a Shakespeare play, yes, a play, saw these gangs turn Astor Place into a war zone, with 25 dead and hundreds injured. Shakespeare would have wept. You're moving now, trying to avoid trouble, but trouble's the 5 points middle name. Every corner's a potential ambush. The plug uglies with their ridiculous stuffed hats patrol their turf like deranged bouncers. Step on the wrong street, say Anthony instead of Center, and you're in Roach Guard territory where they'll beat you for sport. The gangs have rules, but they're as logical as a fever dream. Cross a line, bump a shoulder, or just look too foreign, and you're done. Weapons, creative and cruel. A slungshot smashes skulls, a barker, pistol, blows holes, and don't forget the ladies. Those Gahals wield hatpins like medieval knights with lances. One wrong move, and you're sporting a new piercing. By late morning, the heat's rising, and so's the stench. Summer in the slums is a pressure cooker. Temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit. No breeze, just a miasma of sweat and decay. Tenements trap heat like ovens, and disease festers faster than gossip. Cholera's still lurking, but let's not forget smallpox, typhoid, or the bloody flux. Dysentery, that turns your insides to liquid misery. Water's still a gamble. Pumps draw from wells tainted by nearby privies. You're thirsty, but every sip's a roll of the dice. Fun fact, in 1842, a guy named John Croton tried to fix the city's water with a new aqueduct, but the slums got the dregs. Literally. Meanwhile, the rich uptown sipped clean water and pretended the 5 points didn't exist. You're parched, exhausted, and now you're noticing the kids. Not the cute ones from modern commercials. These are street Arabs, orphaned or abandoned, surviving by wit or theft. They're everywhere, dodging carts, picking pockets, or selling matches for pennies. Some joined gangs young. The YOs had a junior division, training tots to rob before they could read. Heartbreaking? Sure, but sentimentality gets you nowhere here. One kid offers to guide you to a safe spot. Don't fall for it. He's leading you to a panel house where walls slide open and thieves strip you bare while you sleep. Or worse, a dive bar where knockout drops in your drink mean waking up naked in an alley, if you wake at all. Noon hits and you're desperate for shelter. The tenements are death traps, overcrowded, unventilated, and flammable. The old brewery, a notorious rookery, packed 1,000 people into a single building, with basements dubbed Murderer's Row for obvious reasons. Rent? A few cents a day, but you're sharing with rats, roaches, and neighbors who'd steal your teeth. Fires are common. In 1835, a blaze wiped out half the city and the slums rebuilt shoddier than before. You'd think, I'll nap in a park. Nope. Collect ponds gone, filled in with garbage, and open spaces are gang turf or dumping grounds for corpses. Let's talk absurdity. The gangs loved theatrics. The shirt tails wore their shirts untucked as a middle finger to society, parading like they owned Broadway. The YOs had a literal hitman menu, $5 for a black eye, $100 for a big job, murder. Their leader, Dandy Johnny Dolan, rocked spring-loaded eye gougers in his boots. Imagine getting kicked into blindness, fashion as felony. And the police? Useless. The municipal versus Metropolitan Cop Wars of 1857 saw lawmen brawling while gangs looted. If you're arrested, it's the tombs, sinking, filthy, and crawling with lice. Justice? Bought by whoever paid the most. Afternoon drags, and you're dodging more than fists now. Political gangs like the Know-Nothings stir up nativist hate, targeting Irish Catholics like you're the plague. A wrong accent sparks a beating. Women aren't safe either. The hot corn girls selling street food often doubled as prostitutes, trapped by poverty or pimps. Survival's pain cuts deep. Families split by death or desertion. Kids sold to baby farms where most died. Mothers working brothels to feed siblings. The slums were a meat grinder for hope. Evening looms, and you're still on the move. You stumble into a free and easy dance hall, music blaring, bodies swaying, tempting but deadly. These joints were gang traps. Pickpockets worked the crowd, and a spilled drink could start a riot. The dead rabbits loved crashing these, swinging their eel-skin clubs like deranged conductors. You sip a whiskey, mistake, probably spiked with turpentine, and suddenly you're woozy. A call smiles, offering to help you home. Next thing, you're robbed blind, waking in a gutter. Night falls again, and the slums turn feral. Gas lamps flicker out, and shadows breed terror. The YO's bird call signals echo, trouble's near. You hear screams, glass breaking, and the thud of bodies hitting pavement. A gang fight's brewing, maybe over turf, maybe just boredom. The Bowery Boys torch a dead rabbit hideout, retaliation swift. Bricks, knives, even early revolvers, rare but devastating. You duck into a cellar, but cellars are traps too. Thieves hide in stale beer dives, where drunks are rolled for pennies. Midnight's close, and you're a wreck, filthy, starving, paranoid. Sleep's a fantasy. Even flop houses are dicey, with rope beds where you lean and pray you don't fall. The gangs never sleep, and neither can you. Historical pain hits hard. Immigrants face this daily, no escape, no safety net. The Irish, fleeing famine, found this hell. Germans, Jews, free blacks, all chewed up by the slums' relentless jaws. Viewer, pause and comment. What's the wildest thing you'd do to survive this nightmare? Steal, join a gang, or pray for a miracle. Drop your time zone too. Let's see who's up late with us. The clock ticks toward 3 a.m., and you're clinging to life like a cockroach in a storm. The 5 Points doesn't care about your dreams. It wants your blood. Every step's a gamble, every breath a defiance. The gangs, the filth, the absurdity. It's a circus of suffering, and you're the unwilling clown. Dawn's still hours away, and your 24 hours aren't done. The slums pulse with violence, and you're in the heart of it. Stay tuned for part 3, where the stakes climb higher and survival gets even uglier. Welcome back to your hellish 24-hour survival saga in the 1800s, 5 Points, New York's most infamous gang-ridden slum. You're still here, somehow, clinging to life like a cockroach, dodging a boot in this festering pit of chaos. It's 3 a.m., the witching hour, and the streets are a symphony of screams, shattering glass and the stench of despair. You're filthy, starving, and one bad decision from becoming a footnote in this historical nightmare. The gangs, dead rabbits, Bowery boys, plug uglies, are prowling. The air's thick with disease, and every shadow hides a blade or a scam. Ready for the next leg of this absurd, brutal journey? Spoiler, it's not getting any prettier. Let's plunge deeper into the madness. The night's at its darkest, and you're crouched in a doorway off Orange Street, heart pounding as the YO's eerie bird call signals echo nearby. Your body's a wreck, bruises from dodging a pickpocket, stomach growling like an angry dog, and clothes that smell like they've been marinated in a sewer. Sleep? A cruel joke. The flop house you eyed earlier, with its beds of rope you lean against for a penny, is a thief's buffet. Fall asleep, and you're waking up with nothing but regret. So you stay awake, eyes darting, every rustle a potential mugging. Rats scurry past, bold as gang members, and you swear one's sizing you up for dinner. In the 5 Points, the food chain's a blurry line. Let's talk survival necessities: food, water, shelter. Food? You're still clutching that raw potato from earlier, now looking like a science experiment gone wrong. The streets offer slim pickings, maybe a hot corn girl selling ears from a cart, but those cobs are plucked from fields fertilized with the city's finest sewage. One bite and you're rolling the dice on dysentery. Water's no better. The pumps drawing from wells near overflowing privies are basically cholera in liquid form. In 1849, another epidemic swept through, dropping bodies faster than a gang brawl. You're parched, but drinking's a death wish. Shelter? The tenements around you are death traps, overcrowded, unventilated, and ready to collapse or burn. The old brewery, that notorious rookery, looms nearby, its basement's a graveyard for the unlucky. Rent's cheap, but the price is your sanity. The gangs are the real rulers of this night. The dead rabbits, with their red-striped swagger, are out in force, itching for a fight. Their rivals, the Bowery boys, strut in their fireman coats, top hats tilted like they're auditioning for a deranged play. Absurdity alert. These nativists often doubled as volunteer firefighters, but saving buildings meant looting them first. In 1845, a fire on Pearl Street saw them rescue goods straight into their own pockets while the slums burned. You hear a crash. Another brawl is kicking off. Bricks fly, slung shots crack skulls, and someone's waving a live rabbit as a war cry. Yes, really. The dead rabbits love their theatrics, and nothing says we're here to wreck you like a dead bunny in hand. You're moving now, trying to avoid the chaos, but every street's a gauntlet. Cross into plug ugly turf, and their stuffed wool hats bob like grim reapers in the dim gaslight. These guys aren't just brawlers, they're entrepreneurs of pain, running protection rackets that squeeze every vendor and shopkeep. Refuse to pay? Enjoy your new limp. The YOs, meanwhile, are the night's true terrors. Their leader, Dandy Johnny Dolan, with his eye-gouging boots, could star in a horror flick. Their menu of crimes: $2 for a punch, $15 for an ear chew, $100 for murder, reads like a demented diner special. Historical absurdity at its peak. They'd advertise services like a twisted Craigslist and clients paid up. Morning's creeping closer, but the slums don't sleep. You're desperate for a break, so you duck into a stale beer dive, one of those basement bars where the dregs of yesterday's brew are sold cheap. Big mistake. The air is a fog of tobacco spit and body odor, and the beer tastes like regret mixed with turpentine. Worse, these dives are gang hangouts. A wrong glance at a roach guard with their butcher-inspired name and butcher-level brutality, and you're danced upon, stomped by boots that leave you seeing stars. You sip, eyes down, but a Gahal sidles up, offering a smile and a dance. She's no sweetheart, she's a lure for a gang trap. Next thing, you're drugged, robbed, or worse, waking in an alley with your shoes gone. Let's talk the pain of survival, because it's raw now. The 5 points chews up souls, immigrants most of all. The Irish, fleeing famine, landed here only to face starvation 2.0. Families cram into single rooms, kids coughing blood from tuberculosis, parents working 16-hour days for pennies. Women, especially, bore the brunt. Many turned to prostitution in panel houses, where hidden walls let thieves slip in mid-act. The stats are grim. 1 in 3 women in the slums worked the trade at some point, syphilis a constant shadow. Kids fared no better. Orphaned street Arabs begged or stole, some joining gangs before they hit double digits. The ragged schools tried to help, but most kids ended up in factories, losing fingers to looms or lives to exhaustion. By 5 a.m., you're staggering, exhaustion making every step a gamble. The streets are quieter now, but that's deceptive. Lush workers prowl, rolling drunks for coins or clothes. You spot a body in the gutter, dead or just passed out? Doesn't matter. Scavengers are already stripping it. The Tombs, that sinking prison, awaits anyone caught stealing, or just unlucky. Built on the old Collect Pond's swampy grave, it's a hellhole of flooded cells and rampant disease. Justice here? A coin toss and the coin's rigged. Absurdity keeps piling up. The gangs had codes, not honor, just organized chaos. The shirt tails, with their untucked shirts flapping like rebel flags, would start riots over a spilled drink. In 1854, a brawl over a saloon insult spiraled into a 3-day melee, with barricades, muskets, and bodies piling up. Police? Either bribed or battling each other. The 1857 cop wars saw municipal and metropolitan forces trading punches while the slums laughed. You'd call for help, but telegraphs are for uptown, and runners might just sell you out. Dawn's glow is teasing the horizon, but it's no salvation. The slums pulse with life, vicious, relentless life. You're eyeing a church for refuge, but even those aren't safe. Anti-Catholic riots in the 1840s saw churches torched, priests attacked, all fueled by nativist gangs like the Bowery Boys. The know-nothings preached hate, and the slums were their battlefield. You're Irish or sound like it? Good luck. A wrong word and you're dodging fists or worse. Hunger's back, clawing at your gut. You spot a hash house serving stew. Contents unknown, probably best not to ask. You've got no money, so you try bartering your coat. The owner, a greasy type with gang tattoos, laughs and offers a bowl for your boots instead. Barefoot in the 5 points? Might as well paint a target on your back. You decline, stumbling on, but now you're marked. Someone's following. A kid, maybe, or a YO scout. Every alley's a trap, every doorway a risk. The clock's ticking towards 6 a.m., and you're a ghost of yourself, filthy, scared, and out of options. The slums don't care. They grind on, fueled by desperation and dark humor. Historical pain runs deep. Immigrants dreamed of America's promise, only to land in this meat grinder. The 1863 draft riots, still years away, would prove it. Gangs and mobs lynching, looting, burning, all while the city watched in horror. Viewer, hit that comment section. What's your move now? Hide, fight, or beg? And tell me, what's the most shocking historical tidbit you've learned so far? Drop your city and time zone too. Let's see who's riding this nightmare with us. Morning's breaking, but the 5 points doesn't do happy endings. You're 18 hours into this 24-hour gauntlet, and the worst is yet to come. The gangs are restless, the streets unforgiving, and your survival's hanging by a thread. Stay tuned for part 4, where we wrap this brutal tale with more blood, absurdity, and the faint hope of making it out alive. You've clawed your way to the final stretch of your 24-hour nightmare in the 1800s, 5 points, New York's deadliest gang slum. It's 6 a.m., and you're a walking wreck, covered in grime, stomach screaming for food, and nerves frayed from dodging knives, rats, and the leering grins of gang members. The sun's rising, but don't expect a warm hug from the universe. The 5 points doesn't do mercy. It's a cesspool of violence, disease, and historical absurdity that makes modern problems look like a spa day. You're in the home stretch, but survival's still a long shot. Let's wrap this grim tale with more blood, irony, and the faint, flickering hope of making it out alive. Buckle up. This is the brutal finale. Dawn paints the slums in a sickly yellow glow, but it's no salvation. The streets are stirring, and the air is heavy with the stench of coal smoke, sewage, and broken dreams. You're stumbling along Baxter Street, barefoot now because some kid swiped your shoes while you blinked. Your feet squelch in the mud. Let's hope it's just mud. And every step feels like a plea to whatever gods haven't abandoned this place. You're 18 hours into this hell, and the gangs, the filth, and the sheer chaos are closing in. The dead rabbits, Bowery boys, and YOs are still out there, and they don't care that you're running on fumes. First, let's address the elephant in the room. You're starving. That half-rotten potato from yesterday? Long gone, either eaten or stolen. The morning vendors are back, hawking fresh fish that's been dead longer than your hopes. You spot a cart selling hot cakes, griddle-burnt discs of flour and mystery. You've got no money, so you try scavenging. Big mistake. The gutters are a buffet of horrors. Rotting vegetables, bones, and stuff you don't want to identify. Street kids, those street Arabs, are already picking through the mess like seasoned pros. One glares at you, brandishing a stick. These kids aren't Oliver Twist. They're tiny gang recruits who'd shank you for a crust. You're thinking, I'll find work, earn a meal. Oh, bless your naive heart. Jobs in the 5 Points are a cruel mirage. The factories are churning, but they're death traps. Looms that mangle fingers, air thick with cotton dust that chokes your lungs. A day's wage? Maybe 40 cents for 14 hours, if you don't collapse first. Kids work alongside, some as young as 5, feeding machines that feed on their youth. Women sew in cellars, eyes straining in candlelight, earning pennies for shirts sold uptown for dollars. You could try the docks, but stevedores are gang-controlled, and outsiders get a brick to the face before a paycheck. The gangs offer work, robbery, extortion, or worse, but signing up means selling your soul. Refuse, and you're a walking target. By 8 a.m., the slums are in full swing. Horse carts rumble, splashing you with sludge. Peddlers shout, drunks stagger, and the gangs strut like deranged royalty. The Bowery boys, in their nativist glory, are parading with firemen's axes, ready to protect their turf by bashing Irish skulls. The dead rabbits counter with their eelskin clubs, red stripes flashing like a warning. Absurdity check. These guys once rioted over a stolen fire engine in 1853, turning Mulberry Street into a battlefield because, apparently, firefighting was a gang flex. The plug uglies with their stuffed hats are shaking down vendors, while the YOs whistle their creepy bird calls, planning tonight's hits. You're caught in the crossfire of their turf wars, where a wrong step could land you in a brawl or a shallow grave. Let's talk survival's pain, because it's crushing now. The 5 Points isn't just a place, it's a machine that grinds hope to dust. Immigrants, Irish, German, Jewish, free blacks, poured in, chasing America's promise, only to find this meat grinder. Families live 10 to a room, sharing straw mats with roaches. Disease is a constant. Tuberculosis hacks through tenements, cholera sweeps like wildfire, and smallpox scars survivors into pariahs. Kids die young, 1 in 4 before age 5, a stat that hits like a punch. Mothers birth in filth, half the babies not making it. Fathers vanish, dead, drunk, or deserted. The ragged schools try teaching, but most kids end up thieving or worse. Women, trapped by poverty, work brothels or panel houses, where thieves hide behind sliding walls. Syphilis is rampant, a slow death sentence. Mid-morning, and you're dodging trouble like it's your job. A know-nothing rally nearby. Nativist gangs preaching hate, sparks a scuffle. You're Irish, or they think you are, so you duck into an alley. Bad move. Alleys are traps. Garroters lurk, strangling with wires for your last penny. You escape, but now you're near a dive bar, where the stench of stale beer and blood hits like a wall. Inside, a dead rabbit starting trouble, swinging a live rabbit like a psychotic mascot. You back away, but a gal, those fierce gang girls, eyes you, her hat pin gleaming. She's not flirting, She's sizing you up for a rob or stab combo. Noon creeps in and you're fading fast. Exhaustion's a fog, clouding your brain. You need shelter, but tenements are fire hazards. Wooden, packed, no exits. The 1835 Great Fire showed their weakness. Half the city burned, and the slums rebuilt worse. You consider a church, but anti-Catholic gangs like the Bowery Boys torched them in the 1840s, and priests were targets. Neutral ground doesn't exist. Even cemeteries are looted, bodies sold to resurrection men for medical schools. Morbid, but true. Your corpse is worth more than your life here. Historical absurdity piles higher. The YO's leader, Monk Eastman, kept pigeons as pets while cracking skulls with brass knuckles. The shirt tails wore their shirts out like a middle finger to decorum, starting riots for fun. In 1857, a dead Rabbit Bowery Boy class shut down the city with barricades, muskets, and 50 dead. Police? Either bribed or useless, thanks to the municipal versus metropolitan cop wars. The Tombs prison looms, its cells a swampy hell where inmates drown in floods or disease. Justice is a myth, bought by gang coin. Afternoon hits, and you're a ghost, filthy, shaking, desperate. You spot a hash house offering stew. No money, so you barter your shirt. The owner, a plug-ugly crony, takes it but forgets the food. Bare-chested now, you're a bigger target. A kid offers to guide you to safety. Don't trust him. He's leading to a panel house or worse, an opium den, where one puff means waking up penniless, if you wake. Opium's big here, a hazy escape for those who can afford it, but it's a gang-controlled racket. Evening's falling, and the slums turn feral again. Gas lamps flicker, casting shadows where lush workers wait to roll drunks. A brawl erupts, dead rabbits versus roach guards, bricks and blood flying. You hide in a cellar, but cellars are death traps, damp, dark, and gang hideouts. A YO spots you, whistling his signal. Run or fight. Running's safer, but your legs are jelly. You sprint, dodging a slung shot that grazes your ear. The streets are a maze, every turn a gamble. Night deepens and you're at 22 hours. The pain's unbearable, hunger, fear, exhaustion. The slum's cruelty is relentless. Immigrants face this daily, no escape. The Irish fleeing famine found this hell. Germans escaping revolutions got this nightmare. The 1863 draft riots years away would prove the slum's rage. Mobs lynching, burning, gangs leading the charge. Survival's a miracle and you're no saint. Final hours. You're collapsed in a doorway, praying for dawn. The gangs are still out, their laughter mixing with screams. A prostitute passes, offering comfort, a trap. You wave her off, too weak to care. The sky lightens, 24 hours done. You're alive, barely. The 5 points didn't kill you, but it's left scars, real or not. You're one of the lucky ones, unlike the thousands who didn't make it. Viewer, hit that comment. How would you survive these final hours? Hide, fight, or beg? Share the craziest fact you learned, and tell me your city and time zone. Let's see who stuck with us till the end. This nightmare's over, but the 5 points legacy lingers. A brutal, absurd chapter of history that makes you grateful for today. Hey guys, picture this. You're not in the sleek, razor-sharp world of Tommy Shelby's empire, but in the filthy, razorless slums of 1890s Birmingham, where a gang of dapper thugs in peaked caps ruled by sheer brutality and bad luck. Think you'd charm your way out like Cillian Murphy? Ha! One wrong alley and you're done. Welcome to the real Peaky Blinders, where survival was a joke the universe played on the poor. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Ah, the Peaky Blinders, those mythical monsters of Birmingham's underbelly, immortalized in a TV series that drips with style, swagger, and slow-motion cigarette drags. But strip away the Hollywood gloss, the brooding Cillian Murphy gaze, and the anachronistic rock soundtrack, and what do you get? A ragtag bunch of desperate young men scraping by in a city that chewed them up and spat them out like yesterday's tobacco wad. The real story isn't a glamorous ascent to power. It's a gritty slog through poverty, violence, and the absurd cruelty of industrial England. Think less empire building and more barely surviving another day without getting your skull cracked. Yet somehow, these lads became legends, their names synonymous with terror and tailored trousers. Buckle up, viewer. We're peeling back the peaked cap to reveal the nightmare beneath. Let's set the scene in the late 1880s, Birmingham, the workshop of the world. Factories belch smoke like hungover dragons. Canals reek of industrial waste and dashed dreams. And the slums? Oh, they're a masterpiece of misery. Overcrowded tenements where families of 10 cram into single rooms, sharing beds with bedbugs and despair. Economic hardship isn't just a buzzword, it's the air you breathe. The Industrial Revolution promised prosperity, but for the working class, it delivered poverty on a silver platter of soot. Jobs in brass foundries, gun works, and jewelry shops pay pennies for backbreaking labor, and when the economy hiccups, as it did in the 1870s, unemployment turns young men into ticking time bombs. Anti-Irish sentiment simmers like a bad stew, fueled by Fenian scares and Protestant preachers railing against Catholics. Riots erupt, like the 1867 Murphy affair that torched Birmingham's Irish Quarter. In this cauldron of frustration, youth gangs bubble up, first as territorial scrappers between English and Irish lads, then evolving into something sharper, meaner. Enter the Peaky Blinders, not with a dramatic theme song, but with a newspaper clipping from March 1890. A murderous outrage at Small Heath, a man's skull fractured. The victim? Poor George Eastwood, minding his ginger beer in a pub, when a pack of thugs led by Thomas Mucklow descends like wolves on a lame sheep. They beat him senseless with belt buckles. Yes, buckles, those absurdly mundane weapons that could split skin like overripe fruit. The papers dubbed them Peaky Blinders, and suddenly, Birmingham has a boogeyman. But where did the name come from? Ah, the absurdity. Forget the TV myth of razor blades sewn into caps. Razors were luxury items, imported from America post-1903, way too pricey for these slum rats. No, Peaky likely nods to their peaked flat caps, tilted jauntily over one eye to hide faces or just look dapper in defiance. Blinder was Brummie slang for a sharp-dressed stunner, the kind who'd blind you with style before blinding you with a fist. Ironic, isn't it? In a world of grime, these lads prioritized fashion like it was armor against fate. Picture a typical Peaky, young, say 12 to 30 from the working poor, brass casters, iron filers, or unemployed dreamers. Their uniform? Tailored jackets that screamed "I'm broke but bespoke," lapelled overcoats for that gangster flair, buttoned waistcoats hiding scars, silk scarves, stolen probably, bell-bottom trousers swishing like a taunt, leather boots for stomping rivals, and those infamous caps. They'd crop their hair short except for a greasy quiff plastered down, prison style but with panache. Absurd? Utterly. In a city where kids died of cholera and families starved, these boys strutted like peacocks in a pigsty. But style was survival. Intimidation wrapped in silk. It said, "We're not just thugs, we're a brand." And oh, the pain behind it. Born into slums where life expectancy hovered around 40, many lost parents young, scraping by on pickpocketing or factory drudgery. Gangs offered brotherhood, a twisted family in a world that forgot you existed. Their playground? Small Heath and Cheapside, Birmingham's roughest patches. Land grabs were the game, seizing turf from rivals like the Cheapside sloggers, those pugilistic brutes who'd slog you senseless for a street corner. Fights erupted over nothing, a spilled pint, a wrong look, or just boredom. Weapons, improvised genius, belt buckles whipped like lassos, brass knuckles from factory scraps, stones, bottles, even headbutts with those peaked caps. Hence the blinding myth. No guns, too fancy. Violence was up close, personal, and absurdly brutal. Imagine a brawl in 1898. Constable George Snipe, patrolling the streets, arrests a drunk Peaky for lewd language. His mates swarm like angry bees, kicking Snipe to death in a frenzy. The papers howl for flogging, calling them savage brutes. But the gang? They send letters boasting, turning murder into marketing. Survival's pain hits hard. These weren't masterminds, they were kids lashing out at a system that rigged the game against them. Key players emerged like villains in A Penny Dreadful. Thomas Gilbert, alias Kevin Mooney, a chameleon who changed names like socks to dodge the coppers. He led land grabs, orchestrating assaults that left rivals bloodied and territories claimed. Jailed twice for theft and deception, he embodied the Blinders' absurd ambition. Petty crime dressed as conquest. Thomas Mucklow, possible founder, organized hits like the Eastwood Beating, fracturing skulls for sport. These weren't Tommy Shelby masterminds plotting world domination. They were desperate opportunists running protection rackets on bookies, smuggling booze, robbing drunks. Illegal gambling was their bread and butter, controlling betting pitches at races where fists flew over odds. Fraud, too, fake pretenses to swindle shopkeepers. But organized crime? Nah, more like chaotic survival. Historian Heather Shore notes they focused on street fights and muggings, not the sophisticated empires of later gangs. Birmingham's authorities? Overwhelmed and corrupt. Police raids hit hideouts, but community ties, gangs were locals after all, made snitching suicide. Magistrates railed against ruffianism, demanding floggings, but sentences were slaps. Months in prison, hard labor that broke bodies but not spirits. The 1898 outcry after Snipes' death led to calls for cat-o'-nine tails, that barbaric whip. But even then, the Blinders persisted. Absurd, right? A city of innovation, guns, jewelry, machines, crippled by its own underclass. The pain. Immigrants, especially Irish, faced hate. Jobs vanished in recessions. Slums bred disease. Cholera epidemics in the 1890s killed thousands. Bodies dumped in canals. Kids begged or thieved. Women worked factories till fingers bled. Gangs were escape, a false empowerment in a powerless world. As the 1890s wore on, the Blinders solidified. Under Mooney's lead, they dominated Small Heath, clashing with sloggers in epic brawls. One 1897 riot saw hundreds fighting, streets slick with blood, police battered, newspapers sensationalized. Gangs of Peaky Blinders are to be seen, grossly insulting passers-by. Victims, anyone vulnerable, men, women, children. Mug a pedestrian for a watch, assault a constable for fun. But irony abounds. Many Blinders worked legit jobs. Fenders, hinges, spectacles, crime a side hustle. Historian Philip Gooderson lists occupations like a roll call of Birmingham industry, half in iron or brass. They weren't full-time crooks. They were the working poor moonlighting as monsters. Dive deeper into the absurdity, their codes or lack thereof. No honor among thieves, just survival. Betray a mate? Expect a buckling. Women? Involved peripherally, as malls or fences, but the pain for them was double. Prostitution in slums, bearing kids in filth. The Blinders' violence spilled homeward, domestic abuse rife. Yet glamour clung. Music halls sang of them, performers mimicking the style. By 1900, Peaky Blinder meant any sharp-dressed thug, a slang evolution that's hilariously enduring. Viewer, pause and ponder. Would you join for the style or flee the slums? Comment below. What's your survival hack in this hell? Share a historical absurdity you've heard. The new century dawns, but for the Blinders, it's more storm than sunrise. Rivals multiply. The Birmingham boys loom, led by Billy Kimber, a real kingpin who'd later inspire TV foes. But our lads push on, diversifying into truck hijackings, stealing goods wagons for black market flips. Smuggling? Booze and tobacco from canals. Robbery escalates. Armed with sticks and stones, they storm pubs, clearing tills amid chaos. A 1904 report details a postcode battle where Blinders invade Cheapside, sloggers retaliate with bricks, casualties mount, hospitals overflow. The pain, war's shadow. Many Blinders would fight in World War I, but that's future irony. For now, it's street wars, where losing means death or disfigurement. Police crackdowns intensify. 1905 sees mass arrests after a riot kills 2. Floggings introduced, public whippings that drew crowds like spectacles. Absurd? Victorian justice at its hypocritical best. Flog the poor while elites sip tea. But it works somewhat. Gangs fracture. Yet Blinders adapt, going underground. Protection rackets boom, pay up, bookie, or your pitch burns. Bookmaking, illegal but rampant, funds their flair. Silk scarves, from extorted silk merchants. Bell-bottoms, tailored on stolen cloth. Social context bites. Edwardian reforms promise help, but slums persist. Poverty breeds more recruits, 12-year-olds joining for thrills. The ragged schools try educating, but gangs lure with excitement. Women suffer most, bearing blinder bastards working sweatshops. One tale, a Gahal stabs a rival with a hat pin, fierce femininity in a man's world. By 1910, cracks show. Larger gangs like Kimber's Birmingham boys muscle in, organized and ruthless. Blinders, once kings, become relics, but their legend grows. Papers dub any gang Peaky. Absurd end, faded by 1920s, name reused for the show set then. Irony? The TV blinders rise as real ones fall. As evening falls on our tale's first act, the blinders strut defiantly. But dangers lurk. Rivals, coppers, poverty's grind. Viewer, comment, gang life or honest toil. What's your Brummy survival tip? Stay tuned for part 2, where rivalries explode and the absurd violence peaks. Welcome back, intrepid viewer, to the grimy underbelly of Birmingham's Peaky Blinders saga, where the caps are peaked, the belts are buckled for bashing, and survival's just a fancy word for not getting your head caved in before tea time. If you thought part 1 was a stroll through the slums, brace yourself. We're diving into the explosive rivalries, the ludicrous escalations of violence, and the soul-crushing grind that turned these dapper desperados into legends, or laughingstocks, depending on your tolerance for historical farce. By 1900, the Blinders aren't just a gang, they're a symptom of a city rotting from the inside, where ambition meets absurdity in a fistfight no one wins. The Edwardian era dawns like a hangover after a Victorian bender. Birmingham's factories still churning, but the working class? Still choking on soot and shattered promises. Unemployment spikes again, recessions bite harder, and the slums expand like a bad rash. Small Heath, the Blinders' heartland, is a warren of back-to-back houses, where sunlight fears to tread and cholera throws parties uninvited. Families huddle in damp cellars, kids scavenging coal from slag heaps, women slaving in pin factories till their hands twist like pretzels. The Irish, still scapegoats, face fresh waves of hate. 1901 sees anti-Catholic riots that leave streets littered with broken windows and broken bones. In this pressure cooker, the Peaky Blinders evolve, or devolve, into more organized chaos, their peaked caps now badges of a burgeoning empire built on sand and spite. Rivalries? Oh, they're the spice in this toxic stew. The Cheapside sloggers, those hulking predecessors, haven't vanished, they've just gotten meaner. Picture this absurdity. In 1901, a sloggers-blinders clash erupts over a disputed betting pitch at a local fair. What starts as a shoving match spirals into a melee involving hundreds, belts whipping, bottles shattering, and one poor sod getting his ear bitten off like a deranged homage to Mike Tyson. The papers scream headlines, Peaky Blinders' reign of terror. But the truth? It's territorial pissing contests, where winning means controlling a muddy street corner for illegal bookmaking. The sloggers, led by bruisers like David Taylor, favor raw power, slogging with fists and feet, while the Blinders add flair, their silk scarves fluttering as they dodge and strike. Survival's pain here is visceral. Lose a fight and you're not just bruised, you're out of work. Your family starving because rivals torture, stall, or scare off customers. Enter new foes to amp the absurdity. The Birmingham boys, emerging around 1905 under Billy Kimber, a real-life racetrack racketeer who'd later inspire the TV's snarling antagonist. Kimber's crew, more sophisticated thugs controlling horse racing bets across the Midlands with a network that makes the Blinders look like neighborhood bullies. But our lads don't back down. They clash at racetracks like Epsom and Ascot, where protection means paying up or getting peaked. A 1908 incident. Blinders ambush Kimber's men at a derby using cap-blinding tactics, slashing with buckles hidden in peaks. Not razors, mind you. Blood flows, bets are voided, and the crowd cheers like it's a sport. Ironic, isn't it? In a nation obsessed with horseflesh and fair play, gangs turn the turf into a battlefield, where the only sure bet is violence. But let's not forget internal absurdities. The Blinders weren't a monolith, factions splintered like cheap wood. Thomas Gilbert, or Mooney, or whatever alias suited the warrant, leads one crew focusing on small heath muggings and pub takeovers. Another splinter, under Harry Fowles, aka Babyface, specializes in truck hijackings, stealing wagons of brass or beer from canals, fencing them for quick cash. Fights erupt within. A 1904 brawl sees two blinder groups turning on each other over a stolen silk scarf, ending with 3 hospitalized and 1 blinded. Literally, from a buckle to the eye. The pain? Brotherhood's a myth, betrayal's the norm. These young men, many war orphans or factory rejects, join for protection but find only deeper wounds, scars from fights, jail time that hardens them into repeat offenders. Weapons evolve in hilariously brutal ways. Forget TV's razor elegance. Real blinders wielded donkey fringes, heavy belts with massive buckles, netties, weighted sticks, and even bicycle chains wrapped around fists. One report from 1906. A blinder named John Harper uses a hot poker from a pub fire to brand a rival's face. Absurd cruelty born of desperation. No guns yet. Too traceable, too expensive. Violence is intimate, the crack of bone echoing in alleys where screams blend with factory whistles. Survival tip: learn to run. Many didn't. Coroner's reports list death by misadventure for what were clearly gang hits, bodies dumped in canals to feed the eels. Police? Still a joke, but cracking down harder. Chief Constable Charles Rafter, an Irishman with a grudge, launches raids in 1905, arresting dozens after a riot kills a bystander. Floggings become vogue, public lashings with the cat-o'-nine tails, drawing crowds who boo the victims like it's theater. Absurd justice, whip the poor for lashing out at poverty. Sentences lengthen, 6 months hard labor for assault, breaking rocks till backs break. But corruption lingers. Some coppers take bribes, tipping off raids for a cut of the loot. The blinders adapt, using kids as lookouts. 12-year-olds whistling warnings, earning pennies in a fast track to jail. Social pains deepen. Edwardian reforms, like old age pensions in 1908, promise relief, but slums fester. Disease rages, tuberculosis claims lungs, diphtheria kids. Women bear the brunt, working munitions factories, pre-World War I boom, while dodging drunken husbands. Blinder malls? Fierce as the men. Women like Lizzie Powell, arrested for fencing stolen goods, or Annie Walters, who wielded hatpins in fights. Their stories? Heartbreaking, prostitution to feed families, bearing illegitimate kids in workhouses where survival rates plummeted. Gangs offered empowerment, but at what cost? Domestic violence spiked. A 1907 case sees a blinder beat his wife senseless over supper money. As rivalries peak, so does absurdity. The 1910 Battle of the Brum sees blinders versus Birmingham boys at a football match. Yes, soccer hooliganism meets gang war. Fists fly amid cheers, police horses charging like medieval knights. Kimber emerges victorious, pushing blinders to the fringes. But our lads pivot to new rackets, smuggling via canals, booze, tobacco, even opium from docks. Protection extends to music halls. Pay up, performer, or your act gets reviewed with bricks. Illegal lotteries thrive, tickets sold door to door in slums where hope's the real scam. Viewer, imagine you're there. Join the fray or hide. Comment below. What's the most absurd weapon you'd wield? Drop your location and time. Let's see who's up for this madness. World War I looms, casting ironic shadows. Many blinders enlist, seeking escape or forced by conscription in 1916. Trench warfare, just gang fights with bigger bangs. But pre-war, violence escalates. A 1912 mugging spree targets jewelry workers, blinders stealing gold chains to melt down. One heist, ambush a wagon, net 500 pounds, fortune for slums, but split among 20, it's pennies after bribes. Rivals multiply, the Elephant and Castle Gang, from London Eye's Birmingham turf, leading to cross-city clashes. Absurd, train rides to brawls like violent holidays. Kimber consolidates, forming alliances that dwarf blinders. By 1914, they're fading, but legend persists. Papers blame Peaky style for youth crime nationwide. Pain underscores it. Immigrants face xenophobia. Jews fleeing pogroms join similar gangs. Black country lads commute to fight, blurring lines. Families splinter, fathers jailed, mothers begging, kids feral. As part 2 closes, war's drum beats. Blinders, once kings, face eclipse. But their absurd legacy, immortal. Stay tuned for part 3, where war reshapes everything in blood and irony. Welcome back, you gluttons for historical punishment, to the third act of our gritty dive into the real Peaky Blinders, Birmingham's sharp-dressed scourge of the slums, where style was a weapon and survival was a cruel punchline. We're deep in the early 1910s now, with the shadow of World War I creeping like fog over the city's soot-choked skyline. The Peaky Blinders are clinging to their fading empire, their peaked caps tilted defiantly as rival gangs, police crackdowns, and the relentless grind of poverty threaten to bury them. Expect more absurd violence, heartbreaking desperation, and a city teetering on the edge of chaos. The TV show's glamour? A distant fantasy. This is the raw, ridiculous, and painful truth of their world. Let's wade back into the muck. Birmingham, 1911, is a beast of industry, its factories hammering out guns, bikes, and misery. The slums, Small Heath, Cheapside, Digbeth, are festering sores, where tenements lean like drunkards and canals bubble with industrial sludge. The working class, still crushed under the boot of capitalism, scraping by on wages that barely buy bread. Unemployment spikes as global trade wobbles, and the Irish Jews and Italians face fresh waves of hate. Anti-Catholic riots flare in 1910, torching shops and dreams. Kids dodge cholera in alleys, women stitch munitions till their fingers bleed, and men? Many turn to gangs for a scrap of power. The Peaky Blinders, once Small Heath swaggering kings, are now scrappy underdogs, their grip slipping as bigger players like Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys tighten the noose. But surrender? Not in their blood. They fight on, fueled by desperation and a perverse love for their own legend. Rivalries are a bloody circus now. The Birmingham boys, with Kimber's iron fist, dominate racetrack betting, a cash cow the Blinders can't touch. A 1912 clash at Cheltenham sees Kimber's men ambush a Blinder crew, belts and chains flying in a melee that leaves 3 hospitalized and a horse spooked into trampling a bookie's stall. Absurd? Oh yes, imagine gangsters brawling amid posh punters, top hats tumbling like bowling pins. The Blinders retaliate in Small Heath, storming a Kimber-controlled pub with donkey fringes, those brutal belt buckles smashing faces and furniture. The papers scream Peaky menace, but it's survival. Lose the turf, lose the rackets, lose everything. Other rivals emerge. The Sabini gang, London Italians sniffing Birmingham's profits, send scouts to spark fights. A 1913 train station brawl sees Blinders versus Sabinas, with passengers ducking as bottles and fists fly. Irony alert, these gangs, born of poverty, mimic the Empire's turf wars, just with shoddier weapons. Internal chaos adds spice to the absurdity. The Blinders splinter further. Thomas Gilbert's crew sticks to muggings and protection, while Harry, babyface Fowles, pushes truck hijackings, targeting beer wagons for black market flips. A 1911 falling out over a stolen haul, 200 pounds in brass fittings, sees Blinders fighting Blinders, one lad losing an eye to a bicycle chain. Brotherhood? More like backstabbing with extra flair. Their rackets diversify. Illegal lotteries scam desperate housewives, fake coal sold door to door, its painted slate genius, and opium smuggling via canals, a nod to Birmingham's growing drug trade. Protection rackets boom, pay up, shopkeep, or your windows meet a brick. But the pain runs deep. These are young men, some teens, trapped in a cycle of crime because honest work, 12 hours in a foundry for 50 pence, offers no escape. Many are war orphans raised on hunger and hate, their silk scarves a middle finger to a world that forgot them. Violence gets creative, and not in a fun, artsy way. Weapons? Still no razors, too pricey, but netties, weighted sticks, evolve into metal-tipped clubs, perfect for cracking skulls. A 1912 police report details a Blinder named Charlie Starkey using a sharpened spoon, yes, a spoon, to gouge a rival's cheek in a pub fight. Absurd brutality. In a city forging cutlery for the world, They weaponize dinnerware. Belt buckles remain stars, whipped like lassos to split lips or worse. Women get in on it. Gahols like Maggie Doyle, arrested in 1913 for slashing a slogger mole with a broken bottle. Survival's pain hits women hardest. Prostitution's rampant, with panel houses where walls hide thieves mid-act. Syphilis festers, workhouses claim babies, and domestic violence. Standard, a 1914 case. A blinder beats his sister for refusing to fence stolen goods, landing him 6 months hard labor. Police crackdowns tighten, but with a twist of irony. Chief Constable Rafter's raid sweeps Small Heath, netting dozens. 1912 sees 50 arrests after a riot over a stolen betting pitch. Floggings continue, public spectacles where crowds jeer as the cat o' nine tails tears flesh. But corruption festers. Some coppers pocket blinder bribes, tipping off raids for a cut. Magistrates push harsher sentences, 2 years for assault. But jails like Winson Green are revolving doors, hardening teens into career crooks. The tombs-like conditions, damp cells, meager gruel, break bodies but not spirits. Absurd justice, punish the poor for surviving poverty, while elites sip claret uptown. Community ties protect blinders. Locals, fearing retaliation, rarely snitch. Kids as young as 10 act as lookouts, whistling coded tunes to warn of coppers. Social context, bleak as a Birmingham winter. Edwardian reforms, school meals, health checks, barely dent the slums. Disease kills. Diphtheria sweeps in 1911. Tuberculosis a constant reaper. Kids scavenge slag heaps, dodging factory runoff that burns skin. Women work munitions, risking explosions. 1910's Hockley blast kills 20, mostly girls. Men face layoffs. A 1913 recession shutters foundries, swelling gang ranks. Immigrants bear the brunt. Irish face no popery taunts. Jews fleeing pogroms join rival gangs. Italians like the Sabinis carve niches. The pain. Families splinter. Fathers jailed, mothers begging, kids feral. Ragged schools try, but gangs lure with thrills. A 1912 report. A 14-year-old blinder, orphan, jailed for stealing boots, dead of pneumonia in prison. Absurdity peaks in cultural ripples. Music halls mock the blinders, performers donning peaked caps for laughs, turning terror into entertainment. Slang evolves. Peaky now means any stylish thug, spreading to London. A 1913 novel, The Peaky Blinder, cements their myth, painting them as romantic rogues. Reality, less romantic, more tragic. A 1914 mugging, blinders rob a jeweler, netting 300 pounds in gold, only to lose half to a crooked fence. Their flair, bell-bottoms, silk scarves, comes from stolen cloth, tailored in backrooms. Fashion as defiance, but at what cost? Arrests for flashy dress, magistrates sneering at their audacity. World War I's shadow looms large. Conscription whispers start in 1914, pulling blinders into a bigger fight. Many enlist, some for escape, others forced. Trench warfare awaits, where belt buckles are useless against machine guns. Pre-war, they escalate. A 1914 riot sees blinders storm a slogger pub, torching it after looting the till. Casualties mount, 2 dead, 15 injured, hospitals begging for beds. Rackets shift, opium dens sprout, feeding addiction in slums where hope's the real drug. Bookmaking thrives, but Kimber's grip tightens, squeezing blinders out. A viewer, pause. Would you enlist to escape or fight for Small Heath? Comment, what's the wildest peaky weapon you'd wield? Share your city and time zone. Who's up late with this chaos? As 1915 nears, the blinders fade. Kimber's Birmingham boys, now a proto-mafia, dominate. Sabinas encroach, their London muscle too strong. Police raids and war drafts thin ranks. But the legend? Growing. Newspapers blame Peaky style for every brawl, from Manchester to Glasgow. Irony. As real blinders wane, their myth soars, setting the stage for TV's polished fiction. The slums grind on. Disease, poverty, violence. Survival's a daily gauntlet, and the blinders, for all their swagger, are cogs in a broken machine. Stay tuned for part 4, where war, decline, and absurd legacy collide in a bloody, bittersweet finale. You've staggered into the final act of our brutal, absurd journey through the real Peaky Blinders world. Birmingham's slum-born legends who turned desperation into a fashion statement and violence into a career. It's 1915, and the Great War's shadow looms over Small Heath's grimy streets, where the air is thick with coal dust, despair, and the fading echoes of peaked cap swagger. The Blinders are on their last legs, squeezed by rival gangs, relentless coppers, and a war that's about to swallow their kind whole. Forget the TV's polished Tommy Shelby. These lads are scrappy survivors, their silk scarves fraying as fast as their fortunes. This is the endgame, bloodier, sadder, and more ridiculous than ever. Let's dive into the muck for the last time. Birmingham's a pressure cooker, its factories roaring to feed the war machine. Guns, shells, misery. The slums, Small Heath, Digbeth, Cheapside, are hellscapes of crumbling tenements where families cram into single rooms, sharing lice and lost dreams. Poverty's a noose. Wages for munitions work barely buy bread, and layoffs hit as war shifts trade. Disease festers. Tuberculosis hacks through crowded homes. Diphtheria snatches kids, and the 1915 flu epidemic piles bodies in canals. Anti-Irish hate still simmers, with no potpourri graffiti scarring walls. Jews and Italians fleeing European chaos crowd in, sparking new tensions. The Peaky Blinders, once Small Heath's terror, are fading, outgunned by Billy Kimber's Birmingham boys and outmaneuvered by London's Sabini gang. But they don't go quietly, they fight like cornered rats, their belt buckles swinging in defiance of a world that's done them no favors. Rivalries reach fever pitch, and the absurdities off the charts. Kimber's Birmingham boys, now a slick operation, control racetracks from Epsom to Ascot, raking in pounds while the Blinders scramble for scraps. A 1915 showdown at a Birmingham fair sees Blinders try to muscle in on Kimber's betting pitch. Bad move. Kimber's men, armed with clubs and early pistols, turn it into a slaughter. 5 Blinders limp away, one blinded by a chain to the face, the rest nursing broken bones. The papers crow, Peaky Blinders crushed, but our lads hit back, torching a Kimber pub in Digbeth. Flames light the night and locals cheer, not for justice, but for the chaos. The Sabinis, London's Italian mob, add fuel. A 1916 train ambush sees them jump a Blinder crew en route to a race, leaving 2 dead and a carriage splattered with blood. Irony? These gangs mirror the war's trenches, pointless turf battles, just with worse hygiene. Internal cracks widen, turning brotherhood into a bad joke. Thomas Gilbert, still dodging warrants under aliases, pushes protection rackets, extorting bookies and shopkeeps. Harry Babyface Fowles, meanwhile, doubles down on hijackings, stealing munitions wagons for black market sales. A 1915 spat over a looted beer truck splits them. Fowles' crew keeps the haul. Gilbert's retaliates with a buckle brawl, leaving one lad with a cracked skull. The pain's raw. Many Blinders are teens, war orphans, or factory rejects, their loyalty paper thin. Betrayal standard. A 1916 sting sees a Blinder snitch to coppers for a $5, landing 10 mates in jail. Rackets shift to war demands, smuggling cigarettes, rationed food, even stolen army boots. Opium dens sprout in Digbeth, feeding shell-shocked vets and slum addicts. Absurd? In a city arming the empire, Blinders profit by robbing it blind. Violence gets uglier, if that's possible. Weapons evolve, still no razors, but netties now sport nails, and belt buckles are filed sharp. A 1916 police report. A Blinder named Eddie Walsh uses a broken chair leg to cave a rival's ribs in a pub fight. Women join the fray, Gahals like Nellie Hart, jailed for slashing a Sabini mall with a glass shard. Survival's pain hits women hardest. Prostitution's a trap. Syphilis claims half, workhouses the rest. A 1915 case. A Blinder's sister, forced into the trade to feed her kids, dies of fever in a cellar brothel. Kids fare no better. Street Arabs, some as young as 8, run messages for gangs, dodging bullets for pennies. Many end up in ragged schools or jails, where pneumonia's a death sentence. Police crackdowns hit like a sledgehammer. Chief Constable Rafter's war on gangs intensifies. 1916 sees 70 arrests after a riot kills a constable. Floggings draw crowds, the cat o' nine tails ripping flesh as kids watch like it's a circus. Sentences harden. 2 years hard labor for mugging, breaking rocks till spines snap, but corruption persists. Some coppers pocket blinder cash, leaking raid plans. Winson Green prisons a swampy hell, flooded cells, starvation rations. Absurd justice, punish the poor for stealing to eat, while war profiteers uptown toast with champagne. Community loyalty phrase, snitching rises as fear overtakes honor. But kids still play lookout, whistling warnings for a crust of bread. War changes everything. Conscription, mandatory by 1916, drags blinders to the trenches. Some enlist early, seeking escape or glory. Ironic trading street fights for Somme slaughter. A 1917 report. Half a blinder crew, including fouls, ships out. Most don't return. Trenches are gang wars magnified. Mud, blood, no silk scarves. Back home, the slums empty as men march off, leaving women and kids to fend alone. Munitions factories boom, but explosions, like the 1916 Silvertown blast, kill workers, mostly girls. Poverty grinds harder. Food shortages spark riots. Blinders looting shops for flour. The pain. Families starve. Kids beg. Mothers turn tricks in alleys. A Tyson Kylan Caesar saws Tyson het tail. A blinder's widow, evicted, freezes to death with her baby in a cheapside doorway. Absurdity shines through the gloom. Music halls keep mocking blinders. Performers in peaked caps singing of ruffian rogues, turning terror into vaudeville. Slang spreads. Peaky now brands any thug from Leeds to Liverpool. A 1916 penny dreadful, the Peaky terror, paints them as dashing villains, ignoring the blood and filth. Their style, bell-bottoms, waistcoats, stolen silk, becomes a slum uniform, copied by kids who'd rather die dapper than live drab. But arrests for flashy dress rise. Magistrates hate their defiance. A Tyson Kielencaesar saws Tyson het case. A blinder beburton zot a provocativ nadragok miat. Minta a nadragok okoznak a zavargasokot. Rackets dwindle as war sucks resources. Bookmaking fades, races halt for war. Smuggling persists. Cigarettes, booze. But Sabini's and Birmingham boys dominate. A 1918 heist. Blinders rob a ration truck, netting 400 pounds in bacon, only to lose it to a rival ambush. Protection rackets falter. Shopkeepers bled dry, fight back with clubs. The Blinders Empire? A sandcastle crumbling under war's tide. By 1919, they're ghosts. Kimber's Birmingham boys rule, merging with Sabinus into a proto-mafia. Surviving blinders scatter, some jailed, some dead, some in trenches. The name lives on, slapped on any sharp-dressed crook. Irony's cruel. As real blinders fade, their legend grows, fueling 1920s crime myths that birthed the TV show. Papers in 1920 call a London gang Peaky, cementing the term's immortality. The slums' pain lingers. War ends, but poverty doesn't. 1920s. Birmingham sees strikes, unemployment, kids still scavenging. Women work factories till bones break. Men return shell-shocked or not at all. The blinders world, born of desperation, styled in defiance, fades, but its scars remain. Their absurd legacy? A gritty reality polished into TV glamour, where caps hide razors and pain hides behind charisma. Viewer, your turn. Would you fight with the blinders or bolt for the trenches? Comment. What's the craziest Peaky fact you've learned? Drop your city and time zone. Let's see who's endured this saga with us. The Peaky blinders are gone, but their story, equal parts absurd, brutal, and heartbreaking, lives on, a testament to a city that forged legends from its own ashes. You think you know Las Vegas? You think it's all about a tiger in a hotel room, a bad Elvis impersonator marrying your drunk aunt, or losing your kid's college fund at a slot machine that plays a cheerful jingle as it financially eviscerates you? That's the sanitized, tourist-friendly version. That's the lie they sell you between the 2-for-1 steak dinners and the Cirque du Soleil shows. The real story, the one that matters, wasn't written on billboards. It was scrawled in blood, sweat, and cheap whiskey on the back of a losing hand. This is the story of how the worst people in America, A motley crew of sociopaths, dreamers, and degenerate gamblers stared into the abyss of the Mojave Desert and said, "You know what this god-forsaken hellscape needs? A city." And the universe, in its infinite and cruel sense of humor, said, "Bet." Before we dive into the guts of this glorious nightmare, tell me in the comments, what's the craziest, most unbelievable story you've ever heard about Las Vegas? The one that sounds completely made up, but you have a nagging feeling it might just be true. Our story begins not with a bang, but with a sigh. A long, weary, God-fearing sigh from a man named Brigham Young. Yes, that Brigham Young, the head honcho of the Mormons. In 1855, long before the first sequin was ever stitched onto a showgirl's costume, Young looked at a map, pointed to a patch of sun-scorched dirt in the middle of nowhere, and decided it was the perfect place to build a fort, a bastion of piety on the trail between Salt Lake City and Los Angeles. This was, to put it mildly, a catastrophically stupid idea. The land was useless, the heat was biblical. The local Paiute tribes, who had been living there for centuries, looked at these new, wool-clad arrivals and presumably thought they were hallucinating from dehydration. The mission was to convert the natives and create a godly rest stop. Instead, the missionaries discovered lead. And what does lead lead to? Greed. The men started bickering over mining rights, forgetting the whole "thou shalt not covet" thing. They complained, they fought. They probably tried to baptize a cactus out of sheer boredom. Within 3 years, the experiment was a colossal failure. They packed up their Bibles and their sun-bleached ambitions and abandoned the fort, leaving it to the scorpions and the ghosts of their terrible decisions. This was the first, and certainly not the last, time someone came to Las Vegas with a grand vision and left with nothing but dust in their pockets and a deep sense of shame. It was a prophecy written in sand. The land itself seemed to be cursed, actively rejecting any notion of wholesomeness. It didn't want prayers, it wanted chaos. For the next few decades, the place was little more than a rumor, a ranch here, a prospector's desperate campfire there. It was a blank slate waiting for the right kind of artist. And that artist arrived, not with a paintbrush, but with a railroad spike. Enter Senator William A. Clark of Montana, a man so cartoonishly corrupt he made other Gilded Age robber barons look like humble philanthropists. He was a copper king, a banker, a politician, and he wanted a railroad line to connect his mines in Montana to the ports of Southern California. The only thing standing in his way was about 1,000 miles of the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. And right in the middle of it was a little valley with a few pathetic springs. Las Vegas, the meadows. Clark wasn't a visionary in the romantic sense. He didn't see a future metropolis. He saw a strategic water stop for his steam locomotives and a place to build a maintenance yard. That was it. In his mind, Las Vegas was destined to be the world's grimiest, sweatiest pit stop, a necessary evil. In 1905, his railroad company, the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, held an auction. They sold off 110 acres of desert, subdivided into neat little rectangles of dirt. This was the birth of Las Vegas. Not a holy crusade, not a pioneering adventure, but a real estate auction held under a mesquite tree in the blistering May heat, where men in dusty suits bid on plots of land they hoped would one day be valuable enough to support a saloon that didn't, immediately go out of business. And what kind of town did they build? A masterpiece of functional misery, a grid of dirt streets, wooden shacks, and canvas tents. It was a railroad town, through and through. The whistle of the train was the town's heartbeat, a constant reminder that the only reason to be here was to get somewhere else. But a funny thing happens when you gather a bunch of rough, transient men in the middle of nowhere with paychecks in their pockets. They get bored, and they get thirsty, and they get lonely. And so, like weeds cracking through concrete, the first businesses in Las Vegas weren't grocery stores or libraries. They were saloons, brothels, and gambling halls. This wasn't a slow slide into debauchery. It was an immediate head-first dive. The center of this nascent universe of sin was a place called Block 16. The railroad, in a hilariously transparent attempt to appear respectable, had decreed that no alcohol could be sold on the main lots they had just auctioned off. But they conveniently left one block, Block 16, completely unrestricted. It was a corporate-sponsored red light district, a containment zone for vice. Block 16 wasn't glamorous. Forget the Bellagio fountains or the Wynn's curated art collection. This was raw, unfiltered human desperation. The saloons were wooden shacks with names like the Arizona Club and the Gem. The air was thick with the smell of stale beer, sweat, and sawdust. The working girls weren't dazzling showgirls. They were tough, desperate women trying to survive in one of the harshest environments on earth. Fights were constant. The justice system was a sheriff who was likely on the payroll of the biggest saloon owner. It was the Wild West, but with less majestic scenery and more syphilis. This was the first iteration of the Las Vegas gangs. Not the slick suit-wearing mafiosi of popular imagination, but the pimps who ran the brothels on Block 16, the card sharps who could deal from the bottom of the deck with a smile, and the saloon owners who enforced their own brutal brand of order. These weren't organizations, they were ecosystems. A man could walk into the Arizona Club, lose his entire railroad paycheck at a crooked faro game, drink himself into a stupor, spend what little he had left upstairs, and get rolled in the alley on his way out. It was a brutally efficient system for separating a man from his money, and it was all perfectly cynically legal within the confines of that one dusty block. For years, this was the rhythm of Las Vegas. A train would arrive, disgorging workers and a few curious travelers. They would flood Block 16, pour their money into the coffers of the vice merchants, and then the train whistle would blow again, and the town would empty out, leaving behind a few more broke souls and a few richer saloon owners. It was a parasitic existence. The town couldn't survive on its own. It needed the constant transfusion of outside cash from the railroad. It was a fragile, pathetic little town, clinging to life in a desert that wanted it dead. But then, the government, in its infinite wisdom, decided to do two things that would accidentally create the monster we know and love today. First, in 1910, they passed a statewide ban on gambling. Gambling, the very lifeblood of the town's pathetic economy, was now illegal. Did it stop? Of course not, it just moved into the back rooms. The games got quieter, the stakes got higher, and the men running them got harder. The ban was a gift to the criminal element. It taught them how to operate in the shadows, how to pay off the right people, how to create a hidden world that ran parallel to the legal town. It was a training ground. The second and much bigger gift was a project of such monumental scale it seems almost impossible today. The government decided to tame the Colorado River. They decided to build the biggest dam the world had ever seen, just 30 miles from Las Vegas, the Hoover Dam. Construction began in 1931. And what does a project like that require? Men, thousands of them, a massive army of workers flooding into the middle of the desert, working in brutal, dangerous conditions for a steady government paycheck. Suddenly, Las Vegas wasn't just a sleepy railroad stop anymore. It was the only recreational outlet for thousands of men with cash, no families, and a desperate need to blow off steam after a week of dangling from canyon walls and pouring concrete in 130-degree heat. The town exploded, but there was a problem. The federal government, in its typical party-pooping fashion, had created a moral buffer zone around the dam site. A clean, respectable town called Boulder City was built for the workers, and it was completely dry. No booze, no gambling, no fun. The workers took one look at wholesome, respectable Boulder City and, almost as one, made the 30-mile trek to that dusty little town where the rules were flexible. The state of Nevada, seeing the writing on the wall and being desperately broke from the Great Depression, did the only sensible thing. In 1931, they legalized gambling, again, and they made divorce incredibly easy, requiring only a 6-week residency. It was the perfect storm. A thirsty, bored, and relatively well-paid workforce on its doorstep, and a state government that had just thrown open the doors to wide-scale legal sin. The ramshackle saloons and backroom games of Block 16 were no longer enough. The demand was too great. This was the moment that the small-time grifters and local toughs realized they were sitting on a gold mine. The groundwork had been laid. The foundation of misery, corruption, and desperation was solid. The city was a loaded gun, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. And across the country, in the smoke-filled backrooms of Chicago, New York, and Cleveland, some very serious men with names like Luciano, Lansky, and Capone were starting to hear whispers about a dusty little town in the desert. The amateurs had built the playground. Now the professionals were coming to play. And they weren't coming to build a pit stop. They were coming to build an empire. The whispers from the desert finally reached the right ears. Not the ears of politicians or preachers, but the ears of men who understood that desire was a product and fear was a tool. The local talent, the pimps of Block 16 and the crooked card dealers, had done a fine job running their grimy little sandpit, but the Hoover Dam had changed the game. The scale was different now. This wasn't about fleecing a few railroad workers anymore. This was about industrial-grade human extraction. And for that, you needed professionals. You needed the organization. The syndicate. The mob first came the scouts, the forward operating agents of this new empire. Men like Guy McAfee, a former Los Angeles police captain from the Vice Squad. Let that sink in. The man in charge of busting illegal gambling and prostitution in LA suddenly decided to retire to the one place in America where it was all legal. It's the career trajectory of a fox who, after years of guarding the henhouse, decides to open his own chicken restaurant. McAfee wasn't a made man, not a soldier in the traditional sense. He was something more useful. A man who understood how the system worked, on both sides of the law. He knew how to run a clean-looking game that was still designed to skin you alive. He knew how to keep the peace with a smile and a well-placed bribe. In 1938, he bought a sad little gambling hall and transformed it into the Pioneer Club. He put up a giant welcoming neon sign of a cowboy, Vegas Vic, a friendly winking symbol of the fleecing you were about to receive. This was the new model. The dusty, spittoon-covered saloons of Block 16 started to look old-fashioned. Fremont Street became the new center of the universe. The Boulder Club, the Las Vegas Club, the Pioneer. They weren't just bars with a poker table in the back anymore. They were dedicated gambling halls. They introduced the holy trinity of the Las Vegas business model: cheap food, free drinks for players, and an overwhelming sensory assault of noise and light designed to make you forget what time it is, how much money you've lost, and that you have a family waiting for you back in Ohio. For the dam workers, it was heaven. A 24/7 escape from the backbreaking, life-threatening work of building the modern world. They'd spend a week dangling from ropes in the Black Canyon, and the weekend getting their pockets emptied by a smiling dealer under the friendly gaze of a neon cowboy. It was a beautiful, symbiotic relationship of exploitation, but this was still small time. This was the opening act. The real money, the real power was still back east, and the man who saw the true potential wasn't a thug or a killer. He was an accountant. A quiet, brilliant Jewish kid from the Lower East Side named Meyer Lansky. Lansky was the mob's chief financial officer. While other gangsters were busy with Tommy guns and turf wars, Lansky was thinking about cash flow, diversification, and long-term growth. He had helped forge the National Crime Syndicate, turning street gangs into a corporate enterprise, and he had a problem. The mob was making mountains of cash from bootlegging, loan sharking, and union rackets. But it was dirty money. You couldn't just deposit $10 million in cash from illegal liquor sales into a bank. You needed to wash it. You needed to make it look legitimate. You needed a laundry. And then he looked at Nevada, a state with legal gambling, a state run by a handful of ranchers and politically connected lawyers who could be bought for pennies on the dollar. He saw the casinos, these places that were nothing but fire hoses of untraceable cash, and he saw the solution. It was a concept so simple, so elegant in its criminality, that it would become the financial engine of the mob for the next 40 years. The skim. It worked like this. At the end of the night, before the casino's winnings were officially counted for the taxman, a trusted associate would walk into the count room, dip his hand into the river of cash, and pull out a stack of bills, or 2, or 10. That money, the skim, would be packed into a suitcase and flown back east to Lansky and his partners. It was untaxed, untraceable, pure profit. It was the perfect crime. Lansky had the vision, but he needed someone on the ground, someone with style, someone with muscle, someone who could make the desert bloom with their particular brand of beautiful poison. He needed his childhood friend, a man whose ambition was matched only by his terrifyingly short temper. A man named Benjamin Siegel. You probably know him as Bugsy, but never ever call him that to his face. He hated the nickname. He felt it made him sound like a cartoon insect, and if you made that mistake, the last thing you saw might be the Italian silk of his tie before his hands were around your throat. Siegel was a movie star gangster. He was handsome, charismatic, impeccably dressed, and he moved through the world with the absolute confidence of a man who knew he could solve any problem with either a smile or a bullet. The syndicate sent Siegel to California to run their West Coast operations. He schmoozed with Hollywood stars, dated actresses, and ran the rackets with brutal efficiency. But he got bored. He heard the stories about the dusty town in Nevada, this wide-open frontier for vice. He made a few trips, invested in a few downtown casinos, but he thought it was all so small, so provincial. He looked at the sawdust floors and the neon cowboys on Fremont Street, and he was disgusted. It lacked class, it lacked vision. Siegel didn't want another gambling hall. He wanted a paradise. He drove out onto the desolate Highway 91, miles from the relative civilization of Fremont Street, stopped his car in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and had a vision. A hallucination, more likely, brought on by the shimmering heat in his own raging ego. He saw a resort, not just a casino, but a full-service luxury hotel, with a spa, a fancy restaurant, high-end shops, a glamorous swimming pool, and, of course, a massive opulent casino floor. It would be a place where the Hollywood royalty he partied with in LA could come and lose their money in style. He would bring Hollywood to the Mojave. He would build the most luxurious, the most glamorous, the most spectacular hotel casino the world had ever seen. He would call it the Flamingo, named after his long-legged showgirl girlfriend, Virginia Hill. Lansky and the bosses back east were skeptical. Building a palace in the middle of a goddamn desert, miles from anything? It was insane. But Siegel was persuasive. He was passionate. He sold them the dream. More importantly, he sold them on the potential for an even bigger, more glorious scheme. Reluctantly, they gave him $1 million to build his desert oasis. It was supposed to be a quick, profitable venture. It became a legendary catastrophe. Siegel, it turned out, knew a lot about breaking legs, but precisely nothing about construction. He was a micromanager with champagne tastes and a sociopath's attention to detail. He would order the finest materials, then change his mind the next day, demanding that walls be torn down and rebuilt a few feet to the left. He hired his girlfriend, Virginia Hill, to be in charge of sourcing the decor, which was like putting a pyromaniac in charge of a fireworks factory. She went on legendary shopping sprees, buying entire train cars full of useless, expensive junk. The contractors and suppliers saw Siegel for what he was, a rich egomaniac from out of town. They robbed him blind, charging him 10 times the actual cost for materials, billing him for work that was never done. The man who was supposed to be setting up the mob's greatest money laundering operation was himself being laundered. The budget exploded. The initial $1 million vanished. Siegel had to go back to his bosses, hat in hand, and ask for more. They were not pleased. These were not men who enjoyed hearing about budget overruns. They gave him more money, but the clock was ticking. The price tag ballooned to $2 million, then 3, then 4. Siegel was in a panic. He was stealing from the construction fund himself, skimming off the top of the skim before the place was even built, funneling money to Swiss bank accounts. He was a dead man walking, and he knew it. The only thing that could save him was for the Flamingo to be a massive, immediate success. He pushed for a grand opening on the day after Christmas, 1946. The hotel itself wasn't even finished. The guest rooms were empty shells. There was no furniture. Construction workers were still hammering away as he prepared to open the casino. He flew in his Hollywood friends, people like Clark Gable and George Raft, to give the place an air of glamour. But on opening night, the universe decided to laugh directly in his face. A rare torrential rainstorm washed over the desert, grounding most of the private planes in LA. The celebrities never showed up. A handful of local gamblers wandered into the magnificent, half-finished casino, played for a couple of hours, and proceeded to win. Massively, the house, on its first 2 nights of operation, lost $300,000. Siegel's dream was a disaster. His monument to glamour was a half-built, money-hemorrhaging joke in the middle of a wet, cold desert. He was standing in the lobby of his $6 million failure, a palace built with stolen money, surrounded by silence. And back in Havana, where Meyer Lansky and the other syndicate bosses were meeting, they were looking at the numbers. They were looking at the $6 million they had given to their handsome, hot-headed friend, $6 million that had vanished into the sand, and they were not smiling. Benjamin Siegel had built his dream palace, and in doing so, he had just signed his own death warrant. Benjamin Siegel was a man who understood violence, but in the cold, quiet January of 1947, he was learning a much harder lesson about accounting. His $6 million dream, the Flamingo, was a national punchline. He shut it down. The humiliation was immense. But Siegel was not a man who quit. He was a man who doubled down. He squeezed his underworld financiers for even more cash, promising them, threatening them, charming them one last time. He poured that money into finishing the hotel, getting the rooms furnished, making the palace in the desert look like the palace he had seen in his fever dream. He reopened the Flamingo in March, and this time it worked. The sun was shining, the celebrities came, and most importantly, the gamblers came. They flocked to the opulent casino floor, mesmerized by the promise of luxury and sin. The money started to pour in. The tables were hot, the slots were singing, and the cash flowed like water in the desert. For a few glorious sun-drenched months, it looked like he had done it. Bugsy Siegel, the madman, the dreamer, the killer, had stared into the abyss of failure and spat in its eye. The Flamingo was a hit. The casino was finally turning a profit. By May of 1947, the operation was in the black. Ben Siegel was saved. Except he wasn't, because the men who had given him the $6 million weren't looking at the Flamingo's new, healthy profit margins. They were looking at the old balance sheets. They were remembering the lies, the delays, the catastrophic overspending, and they were looking at the reports from their spies on the ground, who told them that Siegel's girlfriend, Virginia Hill, was making frequent trips to Switzerland. They were told that their visionary on the West Coast, their handsome friend Benny, wasn't just losing their money, he was stealing it. He was skimming from them. He had broken the cardinal rule, the one commandment that held their entire fragile, violent world together. Thou shalt not steal from thy friends. Back in Havana, at that fateful meeting of the National Crime Syndicate, the decision had already been made. It wasn't made in anger. It was made with the cold, hard logic of a corporate board of directors deciding to liquidate a failed asset. Meyer Lansky, Siegel's oldest friend, the man who had vouched for him, was forced to argue for his life. But business was business. The organization could not show weakness. It could not allow one of its own to steal $6 million and get away with it. It would set a terrible precedent. And so, with a heavy heart and the clear-eyed calculus of a master financier, Lansky agreed. The asset had to be liquidated. It wasn't personal, it was business, the most personal business there is. On the night of June 20th, 1947, Benjamin Siegel was relaxing in the Beverly Hills home of Virginia Hill. She was conveniently in Paris. He was on a floral chintz sofa, reading the Los Angeles Times. He probably felt untouchable. He was a king in his castle, the man who had made the desert bloom. He was reading about his own success. A sniper with a .30 caliber M1 carbine was crouched in the bushes across the street. 2 shots slammed into Siegel's head, blowing one of his famous blue eyes clear across the room. One moment he was a gangster, a celebrity, a visionary. The next he was a piece of meat on an expensive couch. The news traveled fast. Within 20 minutes of the shots being fired in Beverly Hills, 3 of Meyer Lansky's associates, Gus Greenbaum, Mo Sedway, and Morris Rosen, walked into the lobby of the Flamingo in Las Vegas. They walked up to the front desk, announced that a change in ownership was taking place, and said, simply, "We're taking over." It was the smoothest, most efficient hostile takeover in corporate history. The body wasn't even cold in California before the mob had formally seized control of its new flagship casino in Nevada. Siegel's death wasn't a warning to other mobsters to stay away from Vegas. It was a dinner bell. It was the ultimate proof of concept. The Flamingo, now running like a well-oiled machine under the ruthless and experienced management of Gus Greenbaum, became phenomenally profitable. The lesson was clear. Las Vegas was a gold mine, a money machine of unparalleled potential. You just had to run it properly. And you must never, ever steal from the house. Siegel's murder had cleared the way. He had been the flawed, unstable pioneer. Now, the serious professional settlers could move in and claim their territory. And they came. From every corner of the criminal underworld, the bosses looked at the river of cash flowing out of the Flamingo, and they wanted in. Vegas became the mob's new promised land. It was better than Cuba, less hassle than Wall Street. It was the company town. First came Mo Dalitz, the head of the formidable Cleveland syndicate. Dalitz was the anti-Siegel. He was quiet, unglamorous, a shrewd businessman who looked more like a grumpy uncle than a crime boss. He and his partners built the Desert Inn in 1950. The DI, as it was known, became the unofficial seat of power on the Strip. It was where the real bosses stayed when they came to town to check on their investments. It had a veneer of country club respectability, but the count room was pure, uncut Mayfield Road gang. Then came the Sands in 1952, the embodiment of cool. This was the place that perfected the glamour Siegel had envisioned. Its public face wasn't a gangster, but an icon, Frank Sinatra. Sinatra and his Rat Pack, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, made the Sands the coolest place on earth. They performed in the Copa Room. They gambled at the tables. They drank until dawn. They weren't just entertainers. They were the best marketing the mob ever had. They made the entire criminal enterprise seem fun, glamorous, and exciting. Who cared if the profits were being used to fund murder and corruption back east? Dean Martin was telling a joke and Sammy Davis Jr. was singing a song. The Rat Pack provided the perfect cover, the dazzling smile that hid the rotten teeth. They were the willing, enthusiastic jesters in the court of the mob kings. The floodgates were open. The New York families, the Chicago outfit, the Kansas City mob, they all carved out their piece of the desert pie. The Tropicana was controlled by New York's Frank Costello through his frontman Phil Castle. The Riviera was a Chicago project. Each new casino was a new faucet attached to the main pipeline of American cash. Las Vegas became the mob's Switzerland. It was a neutral ground, a demilitarized zone where the various families, who might be at war with each other over garbage collection routes in New Jersey, could come together as partners in the grand project of separating the American public from its disposable income. And at the heart of it all was the skim. Siegel's murder had established the rules, and now the system was perfected. It was an art form. Every night in the heavily guarded count rooms of the Desert Inn, the Sands, the Riviera, the process would begin. The cash from the tables would be dumped out and counted. But before the official tally was made for the Nevada Gaming Control Board, a trusted man, a casino manager, a pit boss, would dip into the pile. He would take a small percentage off the top. This untaxed, unrecorded cash was the skim. It would be packed into briefcases or golf bags and handed off to a courier. The courier would take a commercial flight to Kansas City or Chicago or Miami and deliver the briefcase to a man waiting at the airport. From there, the money would disappear into the mob's vast financial networks, funding everything from loan sharking operations to the bribing of politicians. It was the lifeblood of organized crime in America, and it was all flowing from a handful of pleasure palaces in the middle of the Mojave Desert. The golden age of mob Vegas had begun. It was a city built on a foundation of murder, run by a board of directors composed of the most ruthless criminals in the country, and sold to the world as a glamorous adult playground. The FBI knew, the government knew, but the cash was too intoxicating, the machine too powerful. The gangs had done more than just build a few casinos. They had built an illusion so powerful, so seductive, that people were lining up to be a part of it. So let me ask you this. If you could step back in time to the 1950s, which of these mobbed-up casinos would you want to walk into? Would you go for the serious high-roller vibe of Mo Dalitz's Desert Inn? Or would you want to catch a show and maybe share a drink with Sinatra at the Sands? Let me know in the comments which brand of historical nightmare you'd prefer. The golden age of the mob in Las Vegas was a beautiful, shimmering mirage. From the outside, it was perfect. It was Frank Sinatra, drink in hand, telling a slightly off-color joke on the stage of the Copa Room. It was high rollers in tuxedos placing bets that could buy a house in a normal town. It was showgirls covered in feathers and rhinestones looking like exotic birds from a paradise that only existed for the price of a plane ticket and a bad decision. It was an empire of cool, built on the steady, rhythmic pulse of the skim. But empires, especially those built on crime, are like stars. They burn brightest right before they collapse. And the very thing that made Mob Vegas so successful, the sheer, stupefying amount of money, was what would ultimately attract the vultures. The problem was a matter of generational decay. The original architects, men like Meyer Lansky and Mo Dalitz, were criminals, yes, But they were businessmen first. They understood discretion. They knew that the secret to a long and profitable career in crime was to act like you weren't in a life of crime at all. They bought politicians, not headlines. They built casinos, not body counts in the open desert. But their successors? They were a different breed. They had grown up on the legends, not the hard lessons. They were louder, flashier, and infinitely more stupid. They were men who had watched too many gangster movies and thought the violence was the point, not the unfortunate side effect of a business negotiation gone wrong. Nowhere was this rot more apparent than in the arrival of two men sent by the Chicago outfit to oversee their crown jewel, the Stardust Casino. The Stardust was the Death Star of Skim, a massive, sprawling gambling floor that generated cash on an industrial scale. To run the show, Chicago sent Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal. Lefty was a genius. Not a gangster, but a professional gambling handicapper, a statistical wizard who understood the odds better than anyone. He was a perfectionist, an obsessive, a man who would raise hell if the blueberries in his muffins weren't evenly distributed. He ran the casino with terrifying efficiency, maximizing profits and making sure the skim was delivered on time, every time. He was the mob's perfect manager, but the outfit didn't trust a manager without muscle. So, to protect Lefty and their interests, they also sent a man named Anthony the Ant Spilatro. If Lefty was the brain, Tony the Ant was the rabid dog kept on a chain next to the front door. He wasn't a businessman, he was a blunt instrument of terror. His job was to keep order, to make sure no one cheated the casinos, and to remind everyone in town who was really in charge. Spilatro did this by indulging in his one true passion, brutal, unrestrained violence. He and his crew of thugs, who became known as the Hole-in-the-Wall Gang, embarked on a reign of terror. They weren't discreet. They tortured informants. They murdered rivals. One of Spilatro's favorite techniques was to put a man's head in a vice and squeeze until his eyeballs popped out. This was not good for business. The clash between Rosenthal and Spilatro was the story of the mob's downfall in miniature. Rosenthal, the earner, wanted quiet, predictable profits. Spilatro, the enforcer, wanted respect, which he earned through fear and headlines. You can't run a secret criminal conspiracy when your head of security is making front-page news for suspected murders. The heat was on. The local cops, the FBI, everyone started looking closer at Las Vegas. Spilatro was a walking, talking advertisement for a federal investigation. He was drawing a giant red arrow pointed directly at the mob's most profitable operation. The old guard would have had him whacked and buried in the desert before he could cause any more trouble. But the new bosses in Chicago were weak, indecisive. They let the problem fester. While the mob was busy shooting itself in the foot, the outside world was finally starting to wake up. The federal government, under the crusading new Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, had declared war on organized crime. The FBI, which had for years under J. Edgar Hoover pretended the mafia didn't exist, was now tasked with destroying it. And where was the heart of the mafia's financial empire? Las Vegas. The feds descended on the town like a plague of locusts in cheap suits. They started planting bugs, flipping informants, and putting immense pressure on the state government. The Nevada Gaming Commission, once a toothless body that could be bought off with a steak dinner and a C-note, was forced to act. They created the infamous Black Book, a list of known organized crime figures who were officially banned from setting foot in any Nevada casino. To the mob, this was the ultimate insult. Men who had built the casinos were now not even allowed to walk through the doors. The state they had bought and paid for was turning on them. And then, the ultimate absurdity arrived. The one force that the mob had absolutely no answer for. A man they couldn't threaten, couldn't bribe, and couldn't possibly understand. In 1966, a phantom checked into the top floor of the Desert Inn. He was a billionaire, a film producer, an aviation pioneer, and quite possibly the most profoundly disturbed human being on the planet, Howard Hughes. Hughes moved into the penthouse suites and then simply refused to leave. When Mo Dalitz in the Desert Inn's ownership politely asked him to vacate the rooms so they could accommodate their New Year's high rollers, Hughes, in a moment of sublime paranoid genius, decided on a simpler solution. He bought the hotel. He paid $13 million, cash. Dalitz and the Cleveland boys couldn't believe their luck. Here was a chance to get out, to cash in their chips legally, and walk away clean before the feds kicked the door in. Hughes, meanwhile, wasn't done. From his sealed, blacked-out penthouse, this bizarre, long-nailed ghost began buying Las Vegas. He bought the Sands, he bought the Castaways, he bought the New Frontier, he bought the Silver Slipper and had its iconic rotating shoe sign, which he could see from his window and which he believed was spying on him, dismantled. He spent $300 million transforming himself into the largest single employer in the state of Nevada. Hughes was the mob's worst nightmare, precisely because he wasn't a gangster. He was a corporation. He was so rich and so powerful that he didn't need to skim. He could make a fortune legally. He single-handedly legitimized the casino industry overnight. Wall Street, which had always viewed Vegas as a toxic asset controlled by criminals, now saw it as a viable investment opportunity. Howard Hughes had accidentally laundered the entire city. He had unintentionally done more to drive the mob out of Las Vegas than 1,000 FBI agents ever could. He proved that you could make more money running a casino as a legitimate business than as a criminal front. It was a revelation that would seal the mob's fate. The end came, as it always does, not with a bang, but with a wiretap. By the late 1970s and early 80s, the FBI had finally figured it out. They had bugs everywhere. They were listening to the bosses in Chicago and Kansas City complain about their man in Vegas. They were recording every detail of the skim operation at the Stardust, the Tropicana, the Fremont. They heard it all. The bickering, the greed, the casual discussions of murder. It was all on tape. The subsequent federal trials were a massacre. One by one, the aging dons of the Midwest, the men who had inherited the empire built by Lansky and Siegel, were convicted and sent to prison for the rest of their lives. As for the key players in Vegas, their exits were equally grim. Frank, Lefty, Rosenthal survived a car bombing, not through luck, but because the manufacturers had installed a metal plate under the driver's seat of his Cadillac, which deflected the blast. He quietly retired to Florida. Tony Spilotro wasn't so lucky. His bosses in Chicago had finally had enough of his high-profile screw-ups. In 1986, he and his brother were lured to a house in Indiana for a supposed promotion. They were beaten with baseball bats and buried alive in a cornfield. It was a brutal, ugly end to a brutal, ugly man. The golden age was over, the bodies were buried, the bosses were in jail. The mob was gone, but the machine they built remained. The city was now in the hands of a new kind of gang. Corporations armed with junk bonds and marketing degrees. They tore down the old casinos, the intimate showrooms where Sinatra held court, and they built mega resorts. They built volcanoes and pirate ships and replicas of the Eiffel Tower. They realized they didn't need to cater to high rollers. They could make even more money selling a family-friendly fantasy to the masses. They perfected the art of separating you from your money with a smile, replacing the threat of a broken kneecap with the seduction of an all-you-can-eat buffet and a ticket to a magic show. The house, as always, wins. The methods just got more sophisticated. The nightmare simply learned to dress better, to put on a clean suit and offer you a player's club card. The ghosts of Bugsy Siegel, Gus Greenbaum, and Mo Dalitz are still there, stalking the casino floors. They're not angry, they're proud. They see a city that has perfected their vision beyond their wildest dreams. So, here's my final question for you. Take a good look at the glittering, corporate-owned, sanitized fantasy land that is Las Vegas today, and tell me, honestly, in the comments, do you think the city is better off now, or did it lose its soul when it traded the mob for the NBA? 10 seconds in Victorian London. A boy trades his shoes for bread. A woman barters a smile for a bed, and somewhere in the fog a gang decides whether civility is worth the trouble. Stay with me. Tell me in the comments which side of the gutter you'd pick. The city speaks in coughing, in the clatter of horses with no names, in the sharp punctuation of a night watchman's bell. It smells of wet wool, spilled ale, and the fashionable dream of improvement, which tiptoes like a con man through the East End, promising marble and delivering more brick. London is not a place so much as a loaf that has been baked too long. The crust flips into blackness while the inside stays stubbornly underdone. And if you think the poor have an opinion about the mismatch between promise and product, you're right. But you'll pay for that opinion with a boot or a bailiff's smile. Gangs in Victorian London are not romantic in the way novels insist, nor are they cartoonish in the way sensationalist broadsheets would have it. They are not even particularly united. They're committees of necessity, clumsy emergency procedures invented by the hungry. The Mohawks and the dead rabbits belong to other centuries or cities. Here, the names are smaller and smellier. The Rooks, who steal like clerks but bite like dogs. The Black Thimble, who sew misfortune into coats and pockets. The Gaslight Dogs, who paddle down alleys in stolen hats. The Petticoat Pirates, women who run a more efficient smuggling ring than any gentlemen, and a dozen ragged crews whose reputations are built on rumor, repetition, and the occasional well-timed shove. If you want to understand them, do not romanticize. Imagine a child with more cunning than teeth, whose best education is the art of not being noticed, and whose highest art is folding a coat into a sleeping body to look like a lump of rubbish. Imagine a woman who will cut you with a comely hand because the law was designed to be expensive, and the magistrate's hearing takes too long when hunger is immediate. Imagine a man who learned to pick a pocket because the factory cut his hours, and he still pays taxes on the hours he did not work. They meet like councils of weather. Agreements are struck with a nod and a look, and broken with a shrug and a few stones. The laws of property and consequence are elastic. The law itself is a thin colonial paper held together by a single, tired stamp. The police, vestigial, polite, and financially obliging, will escort a gentleman's hat down a street he cannot false swear without. But ask them to keep a watch on an alley filled with every shade of bad fortune, and they will consult their pocketbooks, the ledger of fines, and decide if the cost is not worth the badge. There is humor here, too. You learn to laugh when laughter keeps you fed. A pickpocket will tell you the time and the moon, and he will lie with such performance you will clap and hand him your last halfpenny because a punchline must be rewarded. A gang member's boasting is not bravado so much as a ledger entry. How else do you measure your value? By stones thrown? By names avoided? By how often you survive to tell the tale? In the end, it's a petty accounting system for a populace too busy to register accounting. Our story begins where so many others do, at the edge. The docks are a cathedral of damp labor. Ships tie themselves like sleeping leviathans to the piers. Men smell of tar, pickled fish, and the hope that a captain might be generous. This is where the Rooks make their first honest theft, not for sport, but because a crate labeled sugar becomes the currency of a night once it is in the right hands. Sugar is not only sweetness, it is bargaining, it is energy, it is temporary wealth. A boy with more ambition than morality will break the rope, slip the plank, and walk off with a pocket heavy with sweetness. That boy will be promoted to a man when he gives his first surplus to a mother who does not ask for her gratitude to be counted. Across the Thames, the Gaslight Dogs patrol their narrow territories with a theatricality that suggests they believe in their own mythology. They wear stolen waistcoats the color of old ink, and they treat lamplighters like gods because the lamps are the only celestial objects they afford. At night, their eyes catch in the gaslight and shine like pennies left in the gutter. They run errands for the rag merchants, they fetch the necessary violence for a disagreement, and they stand as a reminder that the night is a theater where every act is unpaid. There is a chapter of the Black Thimble that specializes in the art of making people disappear. Not literally, unless one counts debts and reputations, but into rooms where they will wake up lighter by a watch or heavier by fear. They operate a system of favors. You owe a debt. The Black Thimble extracts a pound of pride. Their women are tailors of fate, fingers nimble, mouths precise. They press seams like they press consequences, a sharp line, a tight stitch, a hem that will hold the next time someone tries to walk away with dignity. The Petticoat Pirates operate with the sort of efficiency that confounds respectable smugglers. Men cannot understand why women are better at hiding things. The answer is simple. Where a gentleman sees underworld as a contest of bravado, a woman sees detail. She sees where a button is weak, where a seam will gape, where a child's hat will hide tea leaves from a customs man with a nose for stories. The pirates will trade you a tin of tea for a lie and a wink, and they will do it without calling it crime. They call it business. It has the luxury of being profitable and in the end, less inconvenient than the law. Now and then the story throws up an exemplar. Mr. Gideon Marsh, a name that sounds like a made-up hero in a chapbook, has the misfortune and talent of being both entirely magnetic and woefully poor. He is the sort of man who will steal a loaf because he can already hear the magistrate's speech preparing its forms. He is quick with a quip about the ministry and slower to pay a debt. Those who follow him do so not out of fealty, but because he keeps them alive in a city that will otherwise cannibalize its weak. He is the sort of leader who will offer moral counsel in between instructing someone how to break a window with as little sound as possible. If you wish to understand the cruelty of the time, observe the hospital. Hospitals are a private kind of purgatory where science plays catch up with suffering. The poor arrive with a bravado that will not pass for credit in the ledger of medicine. They are tended with antiseptics that smell of soap and the faint promises of something called progress. Progress, here, arrives at the speed of an undertaker. Cholera, tuberculosis, and a dozen other invisible tenants move through houses ignoring class, biting at the ankles of both rags and silk. Death is neither quiet nor discreet. It tends to be loud and forgetful. People die not with a single great gasp, but in a series of small claims against time, each breath a due. The newspapers, which are both the city's conscience and its most enthusiastic gossip, prey on the chaos. They invent monsters out of poverty and give them headlines. The rooks become the rooks of deplorability, the black thimble the seamstresses of sin. Headlines are recipes for fear, and fear is good for circulation. A pamphlet will turn a neighborhood scuffle into an insurrection. A cartoonist will convert a drunkard into a caricature of modern vice. The readers, who mostly cannot read, but who can tell a picture from a watch, will nod solemnly and reach for the penny that pays their paper. Crime in this era is less a moral failing than it is an economic strategy. You steal because otherwise you must make your family smaller. Because your child cannot compete with a machine that works 40 hours a week for the pay of an idea. The factories are well lit and poorly humane. Their inspectors are men who worship efficiency and disdain compassion. They measure your value by your output, not your soul. And the city rewards ruthlessness with a tax code and a polite society that insists bad things happen to bad people, a policy that conveniently ignores those whose only crime was being born into the wrong street. Every so often, the law will attempt a performance. A raid will be organized with all the pomp of a bad play. Lanterns, horses, the magistrate's best wig. Streets will be cordoned like boulevards that never got the chance to be paved. The poor will be rounded up, mouths full of the night's last bit of bread, and brought to justice that resembles a suggestion more than a system. Fines will be levied, the kind of punishment that teaches one to be poor more efficiently. Another boy learns that the magistrate's benevolence is rationed and not to be trusted. Another woman learns that the court's compassion is as fashionable and changeable as a bonnet. And yet there is tenderness. This is not to gild the gutter, but tenderness exists in the small economies of survival. A man will share his coat if he believes the other person shares his mourning. A woman will trade a piece of bread for a child's lullaby. They invent rituals to keep their humanity, a joke told in a cellar, a stolen loaf split in pious fashion, a song humming its way through an alley like a lit candle. Sometimes the city's brittle heart clicks open and becomes briefly a machine of kindness. We cannot ignore the absurdities. Victorian London loves its bureaucracy with a passion that is both comic and fatal. There are forms for grief, tariffs on sorrow, and a ministry that studies how best to ration comfort. The poor must fill out applications for relief with the same absurd patience of supplicants in other ages. Their time is tallied against their need. If you need housing, you will apply to a council that takes 3 weeks to consider the morality of your request and then offers you a bed that leaks. If you seek work, you will be required to swear by a stamp and a signature that you are fit for labor on a piece of paper that will make no difference to your hands. Consider the middling absurdity of respectability. A gentleman may be morally bankrupt and yet have a hat that would make angels pause. The streets applaud this face because clothes are meant to be read. Lauded citizens throw charity dinners where soup is served in bowls used for the floors of the poor, and they call it philanthropy. A lot of goodwill is performed with china and a pocketful of hypocrisy. The street sees the game and plays along, sometimes winning and sometimes eating the porcelain. Our first night ends in a small, decisive act. The rooks decide to take a watch. Not much of a watch, a cheap timepiece. Its glass clouded like the conscience of a magistrate. It has no more value than the promise it carries. But for Gideon Marsh, it is the difference between having a story and having hunger. They take the watch from a gentleman, a man whose pockets are comfortable because society has been kind to his genes. And the gentleman makes a small protest about manners. The rooks make a larger protest about survival. The exchange takes place under a gas lamp that coughs and shines like a single eyelash, and then, because the world insists on complication, the gaslight dogs arrive out of habit and loyalty to territory. A scuffle becomes an argument, becomes a conspiracy of limbs. Someone gets a sharp lesson in humility. A gentleman discovers that his dignity does not pay for stitches. The watch changes hands 3 times. The lamplighter watches as if this is entertainment between lighting the 3rd and 4th Street. A woman from the Petticoat Pirates picks up the watch later and pins it inside a lining of coarse wool where it will keep terrible, secret time. We stop, for the moment, at the precise second the watch is hidden. It is 9:13 by a lamp the size of an eye and a quarter, past an hour that the city refuses to keep. The watch will reappear with a different story. It will be evidence, it will be leverage, it will be a coin of memory. It will teach a child to lie and a man to forgive. Or not. But that, dear viewer, is the sort of promise that insists on a sequel. If you think you know what will happen next, you are either very clever or a habitual reader of pamphlets. If you would like to decide, leave a comment. Which gang owns your loyalty? The methodical Black Thimble, the theatrical Gaslight Dogs, the practical Petticoat Pirates, or the hungry Rooks? Which piece of survival would you trade first, your coat, your word, or your watch? Tell me, because London listens. It keeps a ledger of guesses and occasionally pays them out in irony. Hold your breath and do not blink. The city is patient, and our story is not yet finished. The watch ticks in a lining like a guilty heart. A magistrate practices his shocked face in a mirror. A child trades a secret for a crust. Which of them is lying to survive, and which to be respectable? Tell me in the comments. And don't be shy, London keeps receipts. When the watch is hidden, it becomes less an object than a rumor in pockets. Rumors multiply like mice in a pantry, silent, industrious, and somehow always present when you wish them gone. The Rooks boast of its theft in the alley outside the Green Turnip, where ale is cheaper than conscience and the landlord counts sins instead of receipts. The Gaslight Dogs insist it was a gentleman's folly, the sort of misfortune that comes from wearing your virtue on a Sunday hat. The Petticoat Pirates claim they found it, which in their grammar reads less like guilt and more like good fortune that fell into skilled hands. Men repeat the story like prayers, each teller adding adjectives like trinkets until the truth is a collage with more glue than sense. Gideon Marsh wakes the next day feeling precisely as the city expects him to, uneven, nervous, and desperately protuberant, with plans that will never pass the magistrate's scrutiny. He folds himself into back alleys like a paper boat. He shares his bread with those who will share gossip in return, information being the only currency with better interest than coin. He knows the watch's hiding place. It is the sort of hiding place chosen by pragmatists, not romantics, and he knows that to keep it is to invite trouble from all 3 gangs and an unlucky number of civic officials. Trouble in Victorian London is never subtle. It arrives on the hoof of bureaucracy. The watch, being both trinket and testimony, will become an argument about possession versus proof. The gentleman whose dignity was lightened sends a letter to the local broadsheet. Broadsheets, like petticoats in law, are instruments of pressure. Press a bit and things break the way the city prefers. A reporter named Barnaby Twistleworth, who learned investigative journalism at the knee of a career in gossip, smells a headline. Barnaby cherishes his nose for scandal the way others cherish a Bible. He follows it with the moral certitude of a man certain that publicizing drowning helps the drowning by scaring them into safety. Watch-stealing epidemic, Barnaby types, in his headline is a whip crack. The paper prints engravings of shadowy figures and stitches across their brows the label of urban savagery. Readers who can neither read all the words nor own a watch clap with their eyes. The watch now possesses an audience, and an audience can be worse than hunger because it requires a spectacle. The Rooks, who had believed they were operating in the pragmatic ethics of theft, find themselves trendy. Trendiness is dangerous. It attracts both recruits and competitors. Young boys with bellies full of bravado and little else wander into the Rooks' jurisdiction, eager to learn the art of not being noticed. They learn quickly that being noticed can be profitable if someone else is staring. They learn more slowly that profit can be a slippery concept in a city that redefines it overnight by passing a law or publishing a cartoon. The Gaslight Dogs, affronted by a perceived insult to their turf, arrange a parley with the rooks beneath a lamp that sputters like a man about to confess. Parleys in this town are less attempts at peace and more formal exercises in insult mitigation. Each side arrives with its preferred metaphors to make point. The rooks bring bread and arithmetic. The dogs bring theatrics and hats. A woman of the petticoat pirates appears as a kind of referee, because women in her line never ask permission to referee. They simply adjust the rules and find themselves in charge. She is called Marigold Finch, a name that sounds like a teacup, yet makes men think of a file. Marigold has the eye of a bookmaker and the patience of a tailor. She listens to both sides with a bored smile and then instructs them on etiquette. The watch, she says, is not to be the cause of a needless war. She suggests, like the efficient person she is, that the watch should be used as leverage. Leverage, in the hands of a woman who has lived on 3 coins and a borrowed plan, is the currency of survival. The rooks will get protection. The dogs will get a cut of theatrical profit from any future diversions. Marigold will have her lining sewn with the watch in a story that makes the magistrate nervous. It is not a plan that any decent newspaper would call altruistic. It is, however, precisely the kind of plan that keeps a night watch from turning into a funeral. The groups agree not because they are reconciled, but because they are exhausted. Victories in the city are like second-hand coats, warm only for a little while and full of somebody else's smell. But plans in foggy cities are vulnerable to the sweetest corrosive, betrayal. A boy named Toby, who had once swapped his boots for half a loaf and later found them at the bottom of a pawnshop tray, grows enamored with the idea of being remembered. He wants not only warmth, but a story about himself printed in a place that will stay. Barnaby Twistleworth's article had mentioned an anonymous tipster who courageously alerted the paper. The idea of being the hero of an engraving is a heady one. Toby tells the paper a lie, which is to say, he tells it a story that will make his life seem cleaner than it is. Barnaby, delighted, prints a new lead: Bungling Rooks and the Ingenious Petticoat Pirates, a watch in the web of vice. He embellishes. He draws grotesque cartoons of hollow men in their Sunday best with watches for hearts. He writes of an underclass that is at once exotic and scandalously like one's own domestic help. The article sells because scandal is comfort for the respectable. It confirms their suspicions and spares them the trouble of looking in the mirror. Toby's lie is mild by criminal standards but dangerous by human ones. A gentleman, shamed by the suggestion that he lost a watch to a child, demands restitution. The magistrate, a man who treats justice as one treats soup at a charity table, careful to do so with dignity, decides public example is necessary. He summons leaders, sorts, and famed miscreants to a hearing that will be half spectacle, half legal digest. The hearing will be photographed by an artist who specializes in moral outrage. The hearing is a theater of the absurd. The magistrate presides with an expression that says he believes in fairness as much as he believes in silk gloves. Gideon Marsh sits in the dock but not in the mood to be humble. He has seen younger men bowed by the law. He has also seen the law break into convulsions when faced with an inconvenient kindness. He speaks with the eloquent economy of someone who learned rhetoric in the school of necessity. He says plainly that hunger is not an offense worthy of the rhetoric applied to it. He says there are licenses for compassion, licenses for conscience, that the magistrate seems able to bestow with great parsimony. The magistrate, who keeps a ledger of moral pronouncements, reads scripture from a pamphlet about order and property. He declares, in the sort of speech that will be printed and cut into illustrations, that the law must be seen to be stern. He finds men he can find and calls into question the character of those whose faces are clean because they have paid someone else to keep them so. The outcome is as practical as it is performative. Fines that will be paid in coin or in labor, and a warning that the city will no longer tolerate watch-related disturbances. But the law is opportunistic. It punishes the poor in ways that make the poor practical. A fine is a debt is an obligation is a store you trade for work. Gideon pays not with coins, he has none, but with a promise to steal on behalf of a gentleman who needs a ledger balanced. It is a rotten bargain. Exchange your integrity for your child's shoes. But this is the arithmetic of survival. And arithmetic in Victorian London has remarkably flexible rules. Meanwhile, Marigold Finch alternates between irritation and amusement. Her lining holds the watch, and the watch hums like a second, nervous heart. She ambles through crowded markets and stops when a woman sells her soup for a pocket of beans. Marigold trades advice like currency. Sometimes she demands a favor, sometimes a gossip, sometimes a talent in return. She uses the watch not because it is valuable, but because it is a story converter. Stories can be negotiated into food, shelter, and shorter lines at the infirmary. Yet even Marigold cannot control the hunger for narrative. The broadsheets demand drama. Barnaby wants a sequence, an act, a duel. He wants an arc. The city obliges by providing a new resource, an accidental death. A man falls from scaffolding on Fleet Street, a scaffolding erected, ironically, to house a statue of a philanthropist who gave much and expected less in return. The man's name is unremarkable, his death is not. Barnaby runs an article linking the scaffolding to the gangs with the causal clarity of a man who prefers simple moral equations. Suddenly, the watch story is a footnote. The city has appetite for death and spectacle. Families attend the inquest, which is a public drama in which the coroner speaks with the polite disconnection of a man who studies corpses the way others study furniture. He examines the body as though it were a doctrine, and then pronounces accident with the definiteness of someone who has been promoted for saying what keeps business thriving. Accidents are the city's punctuation marks. They cause sudden halts in new sentences. They allow the respectable to speak loudly of change while doing very little. The philanthropic societies convene in rooms polished by good intentions and worse silverware. They pass motions, write letters, and eat soup. The soup is usually piping, but their solutions are tepid. The gangs, watching the proceedings from the shadows as modern creatures watch plays, feel their margins shifting. The rooks lose members to the promise of steadier work, an ironmonger's apprenticeship that pays less than a good theft, but comes with predictable meals. The gaslight dogs take to smaller, more theatrical robberies that bring more attention, and sometimes more cash. The petticoat pirates, who trade in trust and technique, expand their network of hidden routes. They begin smuggling more valuable things than tea, letters, promises, identities. They become not merely thieves, but architects of the underground's economy. And Gideon Marsh? He slips between these changes like a man threading a needle with fingers full of life. He is both opportunist and guardian. He steals because it keeps people from starving. He protects because it earns him a reputation that is necessary in a place where reputation is currency. But reputation requires narrative, and the city has a surplus of narratives that are mean and hungry. One night, a boy from the Rooks is arrested and held for a crime he did not commit. A scuffle in which a gentleman's watch, not the same watch, but similar enough to cause suspicion, is lost. The magistrate, now flush with recent displays of moral authority, insists on an exemplary sentence. The boy, who has a face that makes people feel ashamed of joy, is sentenced to hard labor. The sentence is loud and public and contains a sort of moralizing rhetoric that makes good citizens feel better about their soup. Gideon cannot allow this. He knows that hard labor will break the boy's hands and the boy's will. He knows the boy's mother, who irons clothes with a patience that borders on a small religion. Gideon organizes a rescue, not because he is a hero, he is not, but because he is strategic. He recognizes that the city tolerates certain rescues when they are performed with discretion and a plan. The rescue is staged like a small opera, disguises, decoys, and a quiet kindness that disguises ferocity. They intercept the coach, taking the boy to a workhouse and slip him away in a wicker basket that smells like cabbage and good intentions. The escape is messy, the sort that leaves moral stains, but it works. The boy becomes, in the Rook's ledger, both safer and more dangerous. Safer because he is not breaking himself on a road of punishment. More dangerous because he knows the taste of unjust law and, being young, has acquired the appetite for retribution. The city reacts exactly as you'd expect. The papers find themselves with a narrative of rescue and villainy that sells better than either story alone. Barnaby writes of daring miscreants and the failure of our institutions. He interviews the magistrate, who offers a speech that sounds like the pamphlets he keeps in his pocket. He interviews a philanthropist who suggests that charity is being overdone by the poor. The interviews are formalities, theatrical recitations of already decided parts. But something else shifts too. A small shift that is not printed in broadsheets because it belongs to hands and eyes. People begin to whisper about the rescue. Mothers tell their children that there are ways to protect one another. Men share extra rations. Tailors hide more than just buttons. The petticoat pirates create a network of safe houses disguised as laundries and milliner shops. It is not charity. It is insurance by collective cunning. This is Victorian London's most radical engine. Informal mutual aid dressed in the language of trickery. It confers dignity by stealth. It breaks the law when the law is made of hunger. It stitches small resistances into the vast, ragged garment of the city. It does not overthrow governments. It does not issue manifestos. It gives boots to a child and teaches a woman how to be invisible while being unbowed. It is the quiet anarchy of survival. The watch, remember, continues its private life inside Marigold's lining. It keeps time by the peculiar standard of a place, memorizing its own miseries. Sometimes Marigold will show it to someone she trusts, not to boast, but to remind them that time is a commodity and that you can steal it back. She will give the watch to a man who needs to prove he was elsewhere on a certain day. She will use it to bribe a clerk. She will occasionally wind it and listen to it tick like a confession. And Gideon? He learns that leadership in a city like this is both a cost and a scar. He must make decisions that are moral enough to be tolerable and immoral enough to keep people alive. He decides, for instance, that sometimes you must burn a ledger to save lives. He organizes a small, quiet theft that will redistribute goods from a warehouse that hoards imported grain. He calls it adjusting accounts. The theft is a success in the way such things are. It feeds many and angers a few. It sets the philanthropic societies talking about order and property as though food were simply an abstraction. The city continues its theater. Statues are erected to men who fund programs with the same hand that writes memos denying relief. Lamps are lit in thoroughfares and guttered. Soap is advertised by men who have never been cold. The poor invent a humor that is mordant and practical. They make jokes about the inventors of progress and about statistics that dream themselves into policy. They make jokes that are themselves instruments of survival. A laugh that stops another person from seeing how hungry you are. As for the law, it remains the law. It is an institution that performs the work of stability by selecting narrators. It loves to write its name in ink and to make that ink thicker when the paper costs too much for the poor. It prefers to punish with fines rather than ask after causes because asking about causes might change things. Change is expensive, spectacle is cheap. In the end, the watch returns to the public not in one neat act, but in a private transaction between Marigold and a gentleman who has, to his credit, discovered a conscience of sorts. He is not heroic. He is embarrassed. He wants his watch returned because he likes to believe that not everything the city takes is permanent. Marigold accepts the exchange, a promise of fewer raids on certain markets and a quiet donation to a workhouse that, in truth, distributes goods with a discretion that makes the law blush. The watch returns to light, but it is no longer purely a gentleman's ornament. It is a ledger of favors, a remnant of kinship, and a tiny machine that remembers theft with a tick. What does this mean? Perhaps nothing, and perhaps everything. Perhaps it means that survival writes its own rules in the margins and engraves them onto watchbacks. Perhaps it means that the city is a machine that grinds and also makes bread for those who know how to catch crumbs. Perhaps it means that nothing is as simple as theft equals villainy and law equals virtue. Now, dear viewer, lean in. Which part would you choose to guard? The watch, the child, or the story? Which would you burn to keep someone else warm? Comment below. Tell us your choice and explain why, with the kind of honesty that makes a street kid a philosopher. Your words will be the ledger of this hour, and London, as always, keeps accounts. Stay tuned, the city is not done. We have storms scheduled, and a new magistrate with cleaner gloves and worse ideas. There will be betrayals that look like kindness, and kindnesses dressed up as betrayal. There will be songs in alleys, and statues that will be wept over by those who cannot afford to forget. The watch will tick, and people will steal other things. Reputations, nights, and sometimes, in a rare, gentle moment, a future. If you like this, write in the comments which gang you join and why. If you want the next chapter, the one with a magistrate's dinner and a scandal involving soup and silk, say so. The city listens. It keeps a ledger, and your comment is a deposit. A dining room full of respectable faces and one crust of bread that decides a policy. A magistrate practices indignation between spoonfuls. A gentlewoman accidentally invents a scandal with a single misplaced napkin. Tell me in the comments which of them you'd stab with your fork, metaphorically or not. The magistrate's dinner was the sort of affair designed to prove that propriety could be ladled out in portions. Lanterns gleamed off silver spoons like tiny judges. The soup was the sort that would have warmed a dock boy into rhetorical submission. Guests congratulated each other for having feelings that preferred to remain abstract. They talked of reform as one discusses the weather, from a comfortable distance with hats on. Into this orchestra of clinking conscience stepped a trivial thing. A seam, a napkin stitched with someone else's name. A slip that would ripple outward like a stone because the pond was only surface deep. You should have seen Marigold Finch at the room's edge, pretending to admire the drapery while counting the pockets of the magistrate's coat as a favor to a friend. She moved through the room like a seamstress visits her own shop, with permission and with a plan to cut something away. She carried the watch in a pocket stitched for it, the silver face warmed by her hand as if it were a small, disobedient prayer. The watch had been a ledger. Tonight it was to be leverage. The magistrate's dinner was an investment meeting where the poor invested nothing and the rich traded reputations for dessert. The scandal began with soup and ended with a scandal sheet. A spoon, it turns out, is an instrument of fate. The magistrate, who had a face like an argument and the appetite of a policymaker, made an honorable gesture. He rose to make a speech about civic duty, then returned to his seat and in a moment of tactile confusion raised the wrong napkin. The napkin belonged to a lady whose bonnet was made of moral accents and whose pockets hid practicalities. Her napkin bore an embroidered initial, and beneath the initial, a small patch. A patch Marigold recognized from a laundry that served as a safe house. The lady, faintly scandalized, gasped. Gasps travel at the speed of gossip. They arrived at the table next to hers like small homing pigeons. Barnaby Twistleworth, whose pen knew how to find soft tissue in a public life, was present, as the natural predators of civility tend to be. He noticed, and his nose for ink straightened. He overheard an exchange, the lady's flustered denial, the magistrate's officious balm, a furtive cough that could as easily be a laugh. He put down his spoon carefully, as if saving it for a future column, and he decided to follow the napkin's trajectory. A napkin is a spy when you are in a room built on appearances. By the time the second course arrived, a rumor had bloomed. It was not a rumor that began in malice. It began in awkwardness and was fertilized by curiosity. Someone asked loudly, "Isn't that the laundry that tends to certain irregularities?" The phrase was a polite euphemism for charity that preferred deception. The lady whose life had been a sequence of punctual virtues turned the color of a ledger whose margins had been overstretched. She clutched her napkin like a confession. If you've ever seen a scandal prosecuted in a drawing room, you know the machinery. Thin smiles folded into accusations, the sudden moralizing that sounds like applause, the offer of claret like a benediction. The magistrate, sensing his audience swelling with moral nutrients, stood again and produced a sentence in public that would be only marginally more enforceable than his soup. He suggested a committee. Committees, being the legislative equivalent of stitches, hold together what no one wishes to see mend. They promise reform, but deliver the gentle rustle of minutes. Out in the alleys, news of the napkin traveled cheap and fast. It became a symbol. The napkin that exposed the laundress-in-chief, the laundress who had been keeping more than shirts warm. It became shorthand for the way polite life hid its mechanical kindnesses behind fabric and faith. To a gang, such symbols are like currency. They can be traded for favor, spent to buy indulgences, or used as tinder to light a bonfire of consequence. The rooks saw in the scandal an opportunity. The gaslight dog saw theater. The petticoat pirates saw networks that could be leveraged. Marigold saw, clearly and without sentiment, the exact edges of what needed to be done. The committee convened because committees are sightings of intent. Men with powdered ethics and women with practiced patience sat across from one another and pronounced findings in voices like polished pewter. They reached no conclusions beyond the sort that fill annual reports. They recommended an inquiry into the laundries, tighter regulations, and a public lecture on temperance. The report was long, the language was bland, and the result was predictably useless. But as reports go, it created paperwork. Paperwork creates opportunity. Opportunity creates corruption. And corruption, in London, is the most honest trade of all. Paperwork required actors. Barnaby wrote with delight. He framed the laundress as a nexus of a network that supposedly undermined the city's moral fabric. He wrote headlines with the precision of a man who knew that moral panic pays the rent. The paper sold, and sales are the honest coin of influence. The laundress's name, which I shall not bother to make pretty, for she did not need beautification, was printed in a type that suggested a moral disease. Readers that week paid in pennies and left with an additional asset: outrage. Marigold's plan, of course, had never been to enthrall the press. She arranged the laundries not for headline makers, but for people who needed to lie long enough to keep a child's feet warm. Yet the press's appetite meant that the laundress and many like her found themselves suddenly under scrutiny as unlawful distributors of comfort. The law, which prefers to study abstractions, began to ask concrete questions: who gave what, to whom, and why? Questions translate into witness lists and handcuffs. Witness lists become public. Publicity becomes peril. The gaslight dogs, who fancied themselves guardians of theatrical order, began to stage small performances in reaction. They would toss a hat into a market with a letter inside and watch as respectable people took offense in the name of civility. It was a small rebellion, mostly harmless, and absurd enough to give the public momentary entertainment. The dog's leader, a man called Crispin Cinders Hollow, wore his thespian sensibilities like a badge. He delighted in exposing the ridiculousness of the respectable by mimicking their gestures with exaggerated deference. He cried at a statue being unveiled and later picked a pocket of someone who had applauded his performance. The dogs believed in irony as morality. Curry and coin proved otherwise. Meanwhile, a storm rolled in, the kind that makes street lamps snicker and gutters take sudden joy in overflowing. Rain in London is the city's confessional. It makes everyone's shame look dramatic and often literary. In the storm, the city looked like a watercolor ruined on purpose, a painting where everything smudges into the same tonal pity. The storm arrived on an evening when the committee's recommendations were to be published, and it turned the city's ears to the sound of water and made conversations hush like graveled footsteps. Under the rain, the poor find a strange solidarity. Weather is a great equalizer, except for those whose roofs can be proven sturdier by title deeds. Men who steal for a living and women who wash for a living share the fact of dampness, and dampness tends to make people practical. Soggy men become conversational. Soggy clothes become badges of a kind of authenticity. A child who had been shivering for days found shelter in an alley where a group had gathered to decide whether to liberate a shipment of oats. They decided, as Marigold probably would, that some goods were morally allowed to be liberated when the alternative is a child crying in a corner that has not yet learned to be quiet. The oats were indeed taken, and the operation was an exercise in the kind of coordination you don't see reported in polite circles. There was a route, a distraction, provided by the Gaslight Dog's ongoing hat show, and a place where the oats could be distributed without legal complications. A laundry, unsurprisingly. The Petticoat Pirates had perfected a method of turning legal cover into actual help. They hid sacks in aprons, disguised quantities as linens, and smuggled nourishment into houses described in official registers as in need of oversight. This is the moment that you might expect heroic speeches or grand moral decisions. Neither arrived. The work was performed as a kind of engineering, quick, unromantic, and efficient. A woman who had once been called into court for improper attention to the poor stood with a spoon and a ledger and gave oats to 10 children. The children ate like kings dethroned and restored. Their faces, for a moment, were the only honest thing in the street. But London, being London, forbids long happiness. A new magistrate had been quietly appointed in the previous week, recommended by men who liked their disturbances managed and their soup stirred by people who read minutes for sport. He had clean gloves and an appetite for tidiness. He was the sort of man who believed policy could be enforced with an elegant nod and a well-placed threat. He read reports of the laundries and of the oats and of the watch, and decided that the city required a demonstration of order. Orders given by clean hands fall like hammers in alleys. The magistrate organized raids with the sort of efficiency that households use to clear dishes. A little pomp and a lot of assumption of moral superiority. He intended to make arrests that would serve as a lesson and a paragraph in the newspapers. The raids were executed at dawn because dawn is both symbol and convenience. People are least defended before their second cup of tea. Marigold, who had learned to read the rhythm of civic appetite, had a plan. She could not stop the magistrate's men with brute force. She could, however, make the raids more inconvenient and more visible for the wrong sort of people. She arranged for the laundries to be full of very respectable people, widows of minor officials, distant cousins of philanthropists, and one or two parish clerks who had been attending secret suppers. She invited them not as a mockery, but as a counterweight. If the magistrate's men were to arrest the poor without noticing the respectable, the optics would change. The law prefers arrests of the poor. It dislikes the embarrassment of arrests of the respectable. So when the men arrived, they found a laundry that resembled a civic salon. The magistrate's men, trained for simplicity, hesitated. They were not comfortable taking action when the laundry's clientele included donors. The magistrate's plan unraveled like a cheap seam. He had hoped for a narrative, arrests, indignation, editorial column. Instead, he found witnesses who would write letters and supply names that the newspaper would hesitate to print. The raid resulted in a few minor detentions and a great many awkward conversations. The newspapers, always hungry for an image of authority, chose instead to print cartoons of the magistrate, fumbling through soap suds, an image that sells because it masks the complexity with an absurdity the public can laugh at. Barnaby turned the raid into a moral farce, which is exactly what the magistrate had feared and had not expected. The respectables were outraged, the poor were emboldened. Public perception, a fickle instrument, had tilted away from decisive action and toward spectacle. Spectacle breeds opportunists. A man named Silas Grieve, who had once been a clerk and who had been turned poetic by poverty, saw an opportunity to become relevant. He wrote letters to the paper that were half complaint and half satire. He accused the magistrate of using charity as theater and of confusing policy with a performance. His letters were read aloud in coffee houses and distributed as pamphlets by the score. People laughed and muttered and then did what they always do. They returned to making small trades that keep them alive. Through all this, Gideon Marsh lingered in the background. He had been watching, learning, and making small investments in human loyalty. He had a way of being present without being conspicuous, and he knew that power in a city like London lies less in grand declarations and more in the ability to broker a favor at the right time. He still wore the city's scars like badges of an ugly nobility. A missing tooth here, a smudge of ash there, a conscience that had been tested often enough to be flexible. One night, after the raids had become fodder for certain cartoons and the committee had dissolved into an aroma of charred intentions, Gideon was approached by the magistrate himself. The magistrate, humbled by public ridicule but unwilling to admit it, asked for an arrangement. He wanted the watch, the very one that had started this mess, returned to him quietly, not as a jewelry item but as a symbol. He wanted to reclaim the narrative, to suggest that order had been restored, that a gentleman's property had been respected, and that the city could, if one was persistent enough, be made to sing the right hymns again. Gideon considered this. He could have demanded coin or position or a pardon. Instead, he demanded small things that would matter more to the people who mattered to him. A promise of leniency for those already convicted of hunger-related thefts, a discreet note to a factory owner to take on apprentices from the rooks, and most, human of all, a yearly distribution of coal to one of the laundries that had been doing more work than any committee could recognize. The magistrate, who wanted the appearance of moral authority more than the trouble of moral acts, agreed. It was a bargain of appearance. It was also a bargain of consequence. Marigold handed the watch to Gideon, who handed it to the magistrate at a private meeting where nobody took notes. The exchange was quick and almost polite. The watch changed hands with the gravity of a treaty that had to be kept secret, because the treaty was about mercy. The magistrate got his symbol and with it a paragraph in the ledger of his career. Gideon got promises that kept men fed and a look from Marigold that suggested the price had been about what it had to be. And then London did what it always does. It moved on. Statues were erected, charity balls held, committees formed and dissolved. The laundries continued, sometimes audited and sometimes left to their work. The gaslight dogs staged smaller, less effective plays. The rooks recruited and lost members. The petticoat pirates expanded their roots. The watch, now slightly scratched and more important for what it signified than for the hours it kept, rested in a velvet box, in a place where the magistrate could find comfort in knowing he had won something soft. But Victorian London is a consumable. It had to be used, or else it would rot like leftover soup. The magistrate used his victory to fund a small program that would stitch the poor back into the fabric of respectability, or at least make a few of them appear respectable on paper. He handed out apprenticeships that paid marginally better than thefts and insisted on moral instruction. He wrote speeches, he smiled for portraits. The public found these gestures satisfying because they were at once an admission of a problem and a refusal to address its depth. You think perhaps this is cynical. Maybe it is. But remember, the people who survived did so by cynicism of a different sort. The sort that refuses to be romantic about hunger. They traded ideals for bread. They learned the arithmetic of small mercies, a calculus that required the subtraction of pride and the addition of cunning. In that arithmetic, kindness often had to wear a disguise because the law mistook obvious kindness for lawlessness. So where are we, dear viewer? We are at a point where the city has stitched a patch onto its conscience and called it progress. We are at a moment where a napkin could start an inquiry, and an inquiry could start a raid, and a raid could end in a cartoon. We are at a moment where the watch no longer tells mere time, but keeps count of favors paid and favors owed. Now, tell me, down in the comments, would you have handed the watch back for coal and apprenticeships? Would you have burned the napkin in public to prove a point? Which small bargain would you make to keep someone from starving? Your answers will be read by people who like imagining themselves moral, and by those who know the cost of moral gestures in the currency of the street. Pick a side, pick a reason, and perhaps, if you're feeling brave, tell a story of a time you traded dignity for help. London collects confessions, it files them neatly and occasionally pays them back in irony. The city burns a candle at both ends and files the bill under efficiency. A child counts his ribs and calls it budgeting. A magistrate laughs into his napkin and believes it is justice. Tell me in the comments which of them you'd vote for as mayor, and why their platform is obviously terrible. The watch had been returned, and like most returned things in Victorian London, it came back with an odor, the faint musk of coal smoke, a promise dressed in velvet, and the peculiar stain of compromises. The magistrate placed it in a velvet box and wrote himself a note about duty. He also wrote himself a speech and a ledger entry, and somewhere between the speech and the ledger, he penciled a plan that would reassure his friends and require almost nothing of him. It was a rare virtue in London, the ability to look as if you have acted while ensuring that your actions require no sacrifice deeper than a nap. Gideon Marsh watched the exchange with the suspicion of a man who knows that symbols are often more valuable than the realities they claim to secure. He accepted the magistrate's concessions, apprenticeships, coal, a wink of leniency, because what a man can eat today usually matters more than the purity of his rhetoric tomorrow. He made notes in his head, the way a tailor measures cloth, small adjustments, invisible stitches. Trust was a currency in short supply, and he spent it carefully. But the city was not content with small stitches. History, when it wants attention, throws an event that rearranges everyone's plans. In our case, it arrived as a fire. Not the romantic blaze of poems, but the efficient, indiscriminate kind. A bakery on Fleet Street caught, rumor said, from a candle left in a window because a widow who worked the night shift had fallen asleep. Fire is democracy in flames. It reduces everyone's status to the color of their coats and the size of their lungs. The bakery belonged on paper to a respectable man called Mr. Hargreaves, who claimed to be a philanthropist and charged rent to those who could ill afford it. He had recently hosted a small dinner where he spoke about civic virtue and toasted those who did the most for charity. His guest had left smelling of port and righteousness. The flames took his roof with a sort of impartial satisfaction. The poor who lived above his bakery, families who had paid him in tokens and promises, woke to find their rooms full of smoke and their future full of ash. A fire is a kind of revealer. It pulls the curtains back and shows which people have a mattress and which have a cardboard philosophy. In the morning, when the smoke had cleared and the embers still smoldered like guilty confessions, the city found its new chorus lines, the respectable who offered platitudes, the philanthropists who wrote checks that read like apologies, the officials who took photographs with shocked faces, and the poor who counted their losses with the sort of dry arithmetic learned in hunger. The broadsheets ran images of soot-streaked faces beside portraits of Mr. Hargreaves, who had a look that said, "I am shocked and also insured." Marigold Finch moved through the ruined street like a woman who understood that destruction often yields opportunity. The laundries were now houses where space could be found and goods redistributed. A ruined bakery had flour that no respectable ledger would ever record as charity. The petticoat pirates organized routes of supply with the cool efficiency of women who sew their plans into the hems of their skirts. They took sacks of flour and, with a civility that annoyed no one and consoled many, produced bread. The rooks supplied muscle and quick hands. The gaslight dogs provided the spectacle that distracted the press when redistributions might otherwise attract police attention. Yet such generosity, when performed often and without headline, becomes a kind of quiet revolution. People who are fed learn to keep breathing long enough to have ideas. A child with full belly discovers he can think beyond the next hour. A woman with warm feet remembers the shape of a smile. These are the radical acts the city seldom notices because they do not fit neatly into a column inch. It is fair, perhaps, to believe that London would have tolerated these small insurrections forever if another element had not arrived, an inspector from a newly christened branch of law enforcement who wore a coat that smelled faintly of cedar and the certainty of progress. He called himself Inspector Pembroke and had read more manuals on policing than stars in his sky. He liked systems and the illusion of control. Where the magistrate preferred pomp and signatures, Pembroke preferred boxes and diagrams. He drew lines on maps and believed that if you traced the right shape around a problem, you would contain it. Pembroke's arrival was an affront to improvisation. He saw the petticoat pirates' networks as corrupt arteries that threatened civic health. He saw the rooks as a supply chain to be interrupted. He saw the gaslight dogs as theatrical nuisances requiring severe footnotes. He began to make inquiries, collect testimonies, and map relationships with a zeal that suggested a man who had once loved jigsaw puzzles and had discovered an entire people to be arranged. Gideon, who had little love for men who believed they could organize human hunger with a map, watched Pembroke chart a circle around neighborhoods where kindness had always been the kind of tax-free economy. Pembroke's charts were neat, colored lines, a legend, and the brief satisfaction of knowing where to send the forms. He did not understand that the city's safety net was not a chartable thing, but a web, interwoven, messy, and held together by promises that refused to fit into bureaucratic boxes. When Pembroke began to make arrests for a suspicious congregation, he did not notice that his actions would force improvisers into the open. Arrests are like wrenches thrown into a machine. They change the force lines, the balances, the rhythms. A raid on a laundry, however politely carried out, reveals seamstresses who make more than clothes. A dawn arrest of a man redistributing flour looks to a magistrate like endangered law. To a neighborhood, it looks like theft punished for charity. Pembroke believed in the simple narrative: disrupt the networks, and the problem will resolve. The city, being older and more sarcastic than men with charts, laughed and tightened its seams. The first major confrontation came on a wet Tuesday. Pembroke, with the clumsiness of confidence, led a squad to the laundry that had been the petticoat pirates' headquarters. He believed that by arresting a few ringleaders, he would send a message and perhaps earn a commendation. What he found was a room full of people who had been resourced to feed the aftermath of the bakery fire. Widows with infants, journeymen out of work, a few minor officials who disliked the cold, and tucked neatly behind a row of tubs, a man called Silas Grieve, with a pamphlet under his arm and indignation on his sleeve. Pembroke flanked his men like a man who had learned the value of a good silhouette. He expecting a struggle, a ruckus. Instead, the room erupted into argument, not the kind of argument that ends in fists, but in speeches, appeals, and the precise sort of moral confusion Pembroke had not accounted for. Silas read aloud a letter that accused the magistrate of theater and the inspector of cruelty. The widows wept and the journeymen shouted about their ruined wages. Pembroke paused because human noise made his diagrams illegible. The sketch in the paper the next day showed Pembroke surrounded by tubs, his neat boxes diffused into the steam of soap. Barnaby Twistleworth declared the raid a comic failure and printed a cartoon of Pembroke tripping over a petticoat. Pembroke's reputation, fragile as it was built on a map, took a dent. He doubled down, which is to say he organized more raids and began to provoke the sort of attention that feeds newspapers and makes men forget compassion. Gideon realized that Pembroke could not be negotiated with in private. He was a man who needed to be outwitted in public. He and Marigold devised a plan that was less about confrontation and more about outmaneuvering an inspector with a compass. They understood Pembroke's weakness. Well, he loved clarity, and clarity is often produced by spectacle, so they gave him one. A theatrical performance in which the inspector would be the main prop. It began with a funeral. Funerals, in London, are moral real estate. They create space for speeches, for sympathy, and for public memory. The Rooks announced a funeral for the child who had been killed in the factory. The factory owner, a man who paid in promises and esteemed his own efficiency, organized a small display of regret and sent a wreath. The magistrate, obligated by optics, attended with a face styled for sorrow. Pembroke, eager to stamp the grave with his badge of authority, went to observe and to program. The funeral, however, was not a simple sermon. It became a demonstration of what the city could be when it did not listen only to men with ledgers. Gideon had arranged for the mourners to include not only the bereaved, but also a number of respectable citizens who had been quietly aided by the laundries and by the redistribution schemes. He had arranged for the press to be fed a narrative of reconciliation. He had arranged, in short, a chorus that would sing back at any inspector who tried to claim the moral high ground. Pembroke, in the midst of his staged moralism, found himself at the center of a public theater, in which everyone had a voice and many had reasons. Mothers spoke about the failures of the factory system. A former magistrate's widow spoke about charity done with discretion. A factory apprentice, now renewed by an apprenticeship provided through a bargain Gideon had struck, spoke about learning of trade that did not require the theft of bread. Pembroke's neat narrative of disruption dissolved under the weight of these testimonies. He had wanted to make arrests. Instead, he had been made to listen. The most dangerous thing for a bureaucrat who lives on boxes. The newspapers spun this into a new kind of spectacle. Barnaby, who likes complexity when it sells, wrote a feature titled, "When the City Weeps, a Moral Audit." He criticized Pembroke with honeyed satire and praised Gideon with a caveat that preserved the public's ability to feel superior. Pembroke, who had believed in maps and boxes, felt the world tilt under him. He reacted as men in charts often do. He redoubled his diagrams. He requested more men, and he began to imagine a crackdown so thorough it would require its own pamphlet. That was the moment when the city, weary and clever, decided to test Pembroke in the only language he understood. Optics. They staged small inconveniences with a precision that suggested an invisible hand. They created the sort of petty legal tangles that made his charts look like doodles. They sent petitions with so many names that Pembroke's clerk simply stopped reading. They flooded the magistrate's office with letters that praised reforms that Pembroke's raids would never achieve. The city organized itself like a reluctant orchestra playing at the conductor's expense. In response, Pembroke proposed a public parade of authority, a procession of policemen that would walk through certain neighborhoods and remind the poor of their place. He imagined the parade as a painting with himself at the center. Gideon and Marigold, who now had experience converting spectacle into leverage, invited certain respectable allies to the parade: the philanthropists who preferred a brand of charity that cost little, the middling merchants who wanted order for whist, commerce, and even a novelist who liked to be seen as concerned. The day of the parade, the city produced a counter-performance. Where Pembroke expected fear, the people offered junk in jars. Children offered songs and pocket watches wound to the wrong time. The petticoat pirates walked with baskets of bread distributed politely to those in the parade's path. The gaslight dogs put on a show of deference and then quietly lifted the silk gloves of a few self-important onlookers. It was theater and theft, kindness and mockery, all braided together in a way that made the inspector's spreadsheets look tragically naive. Pembroke's parade became a carnival of absurdity. A woman handed him a cup of tea that lacked sugar and contained, instead, a note that read, "For your records, hunger is not in your boxes." The inspector, face reddening, fumbled through his papers. The public laughed. Barnaby printed a headline calling it "Order's Folly." Pembroke, whose faith in diagrams had been shaken, found himself outmaneuvered by a city that had always been more practiced than planned. In the aftermath, a strange detente settled over certain districts. Pembroke was reassigned to a bureau where maps mattered more than people. The magistrate, who had always enjoyed the appearance of virtue, continued to write speeches and host dinners that smelled of port and good intentions. Gideon continued to broker favors and balance ledgers of a different sort. Favors owed and favors kept. Marigold stitched her life and her wealth of small mercies into linings and hems, and the petticoat pirates expanded their roots like cartographers of kindness. The watch, which had been the odd coin around which all these threads twisted, was never again merely a watch. It sat in a place where dignitaries liked to glance at it and feel the illusion of control. But among the poor and the inventive, it had a different name. The little thing that counted favors. It ticked its own small history, and sometimes Gideon would wind it and smile, thinking of how often a small object can cause such big trouble. What did all this change? Not the state? Not entirely. The factories still ran on the backs of the willing and the weary. The magistrates still wrote speeches and kept a certain soft conscience. The newspapers still printed cartoons and made tragedies into entertainment. But something else altered. The city's secret infrastructure of survival became more visible, not to those who would crush it with laws, but to those who might nourish it with small investments. Apprenticeships, distributed coals, a few quieter magistrates. None of these were revolution. They were, however, lifelines that a coastline of people could grab onto when the tide came up. And tenderness, that strange currency made of stubborn habit, continued to be the only form of immortality the poor could afford. People who share soup remember each other when official records forget. Women who sewed into hems hid more than fabric. They hid paths out of hunger. Boys who learned to pick pockets learned the ethics of survival and, in some rare twisted way, the grammar of solidarity. These are the things that do not make headlines because they refuse to be dramatic. They are steady, awkward, and horribly effective. So here we end, or pause, with London as it has always been, a half-sainted city that peddles virtue in parlors and peddles mercy in alleys. It produces speeches and soot in equal measure and makes saints out of those who can make a loaf out of a rumor. The watch sits in its velvet box, keeping time that is both indifferent and intimate. The magistrate writes another speech. Marigold sells a button and hides a coin in the seam. Gideon walks the streets with his ledger of favors, and Pembroke draws his boxes in a bureau no one visits. Now, tell me, given the chance, which economy would you defend? The magistrate's polished charity that buys your applause, or the laundress's hidden network that keeps a child from shivering? Would you trade a week of your dignity for a month of someone else's life? Which small, morally ambiguous trade would you make to keep a stranger from going hungry? Write it in the comments like it's a secret, because in London, secrets are a form of capital, and sometimes the smallest confession can be the most revolutionary.